This is the Occult
Beatles.
Yes, this is the Occult Beatles. Hello, my name's Matt Sergio. I'm the proprietor of the website, The Occult Beatles, and I'm also the proprietor of Conspiro Media, a website that takes a look at the so-called counterculture of the 1960s in Great Britain and in particular in London, checking to see if there's any evidence of it having been a social engineering enterprise. As I'm recording this now, it's November 2024, and I think it was in July of 2024 that there was the re-release in box set form of John Lennon's 1973 album Mind Games. And then I think it was a couple of months after that, in September of 2024, again, if I'm not mistaken, that there was the release of the accompanying book to the box set, also called Mind Games and credited to John Lennon and his widow, Yoko Ono. So, and this book is the reason why I'm here in front of you right now. This is why I'm here right now. I've put together a presentation looking at various pages within this book because if you're interested in looking at the career and the life of the Beatles, whether as a band or with regards to one or two members within the band in a solo context, if you're interested in looking at the band and or members of the band from an occult conspiratorial angle, then I think it's safe to suggest that I think you'll find some of the pages within this book rather interesting, rather enlightening even. So that's why I'm here putting together this presentation, to look at various pages within this book, which I think might be of interest to you. For a number of years now, as you may well be aware, with regards to the Beatles and looking at them from an occult conspiratorial angle, a number of authors, researchers, public speakers, podcasters have looked at the Beatles from an occult conspiratorial angle and connected them to Aleister Crowley, the notorious occultist of the early 20th century. And perhaps the most obvious example with regards to Crowley and the Beatles and connections, I think it's safe to say the most obvious example, if you're looking for connections, is on the front cover of the Beatles' 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, because of course Aleister Crowley features on the cover of that. He also features in some shape or form in the Beatles' 1967 movie Magical Mystery Tour, which was directed, produced, and written and financed by the Beatles. I don't know if you've seen the film, but there's two or three scenes in the film where we see the Beatles appearing as wizards, as magicians. And there's one particular scene where we see the Beatles as wizards, and the scene opens, and we in the scene as it opens, we see Paul, George, and Ringo dressed as wizards, larking around, and then John walks in dressed as a wizard, as a magician. He walks into the room, and as he's walking into the room, if you look behind him, there's on the wall there are a load of pieces of paper stuck to the wall, taped to the wall. And if you look at one or two of the pieces of paper that are stuck to the wall, they're illustrations, they're pictures. They're said to be occult, symbolic representations of Aleister Crowley, as drawn and designed by a woman by the name of Steffi Grant, who was married to an occultist by the name of Kenneth Grant. And Kenneth Grant, if I'm not mistaken, back in the 1940s, when he was a youngster, worked for a time for Aleister Crowley as his secretary. And yeah, those illustrations that you see on the back in Magical Mystery Tour behind John Lennon on the wall are said to be illustrations, occult representations of Aleister Crowley. They feature in the Grant's book titled The Carfax Monographs. And again, from Magical Mystery Tour, from their 1967 movie, there's a sequence in it where we see them performing. We see the Beatles performing the song, the song credited to John Lennon, "I Am the Walrus," and of course the opening lines to that song, as sung by John, the opening lines to that are "I am he, as you are me." And what was it that Aleister Crowley wrote in his one of his written works, which is titled, if I'm not pronouncing this wrong, Liber Aber? What was it he wrote? And I quote: "Let him write backwards with either hand. Let him constantly watch, if convenient, cinema films and listen to phonograph records reversed. And let him so accustom himself to these that they appear natural and appreciable as a whole. Let him practice speaking backwards. Thus, for I am he, let him say ma I. Let him learn to read backwards." And indeed, the Beatles were pioneers in backwards recording. It was in 1966 they recorded the song. Again, it was a John song, credited to John. They recorded the song "Rain," and in one of the verses in the song, it's played backwards in the song. So we hear John singing one of the verses, or part of the verses, I think, backwards. Let him sing backwards. And of course, what was it? What was one of Aleister Crowley's most famous mottos? "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Well, it was in 1980, shortly before John Lennon was shot dead. He appeared in an interview for Playboy magazine. And during that interview, the interviewer asked him, what were the Beatles about? What did they represent? And this is what he said, and I quote: "What's this game of doing things because other people want it? The whole Beatle idea was to do what you want, right? To take your own responsibility. Do what you want and try not to harm other people, right? Do what thou willst, as long as it doesn't hurt somebody." Another famous word, as opposed to a motto, credited to Crowley, is the word magic, spelt with a K. And if we look inside the Mind Games book, there is a scrap of paper featured in there with John Lennon working out the lyrics to the song Mind Games, the actual title song to the album, and which was released as a single as well. And if you look at the lyrics there, he's actually spelt the word magic with a K on the end. Now, this wasn't how it was finally released. When it was finally released officially, the lyric, the word magic had the K taken out of it, and it was just Magic. And again, to quote Crowley with regards to the word magic and what it meant to him, and I quote: "Let me explain in a few words how it came about that I blazoned the word magic upon the banner that I have borne before me all my life. Before I touched my teens, I was already aware that I was the beast, whose number is 666. I did not understand in the least what that implied. It was a passionately ecstatic sense of identity. In my third year at Cambridge University, I devoted myself consciously to the great work, understanding thereby the work of becoming a spiritual being, free from the constraints, accidents, and deceptions of material existence. I found myself at a loss for a name to designate my work. I chose, therefore, the name Magick with a K, as essentially the most sublime and actually the most discredited of all the available terms. I swore to rehabilitate magic with a K, to identify it with my own career, and to compel mankind to respect, love, and trust that which they scorned, hated, and feared. I have kept my word. But the time is now come for me to carry my banner into the thick of the press of human life. I must make magic the essential factor in the life of all. I must explain and justify my position by formulating a definition of magic and setting forth its main principles in such a way that all may understand instantly that their souls, their lives, in relation with every other human being in every circumstance, depend upon magic and the right comprehension and right application thereof. Magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. Now, with regards to the song Mind Games, John Lennon also said in one or two interviews that the song was actually based on a book that he read, a very interesting book, something I'm going to dive into a little bit later on in this presentation. I think it might interest you. But certainly, if we look inside the book, over the years, I've mentioned a few connections there, connecting the Beatles and Crowley, Lennon and Crowley. Some of the connections are perhaps more solid, more provable than others. But what this Mind Games book does, and what it does, is it pretty much proves categorically, sweeps away any doubts that one may have had previously, that indeed, whether the Beatles were or weren't, John Lennon certainly was somebody who was very much interested in the works of Aleister Crowley. So, yeah, let's dive in. Let's take a look at this book. So yeah, there's actually quite a substantial amount of attention given over to the occult in this book. There's a dedicated section to it, in fact, under the main heading, some call it magic. And within that main heading, there are subheadings, such as this one that you can see here, Lifting the Veil, which is a line taken from the song, from the lyrics of the song Mind Games. And there you have tarot cards there, of course, under that heading. Moving forward through the pages, there's the actual main title within this significant part of the book that's dedicated to the occult. There you go. Some call it magic, the main title. And there's a photo there of Yoko Ono with a crystal ball. Now, one of the confusing aspects of this book for me is the part of the book which is dedicated to the occult, and the subheading of which is given the title of John's Portfolio of Diaries, which is what you're looking at right now. But to me, it looks like parts from a scrapbook. So yeah, and here we have a quote attributed to John. Many, if not all, great men and women were mystics, in a sense, John is quoted as saying here. Einstein, who at the end of his life remarked that if he had to do it over, he would have spent more time on the spiritual. Pythagoras and Newton were mystics. In order to receive the Holy Spirit, i.e. creative inspiration, whether you are labelled an artist, scientist, mystic, psychic, etc., the main problem was emptying the mind. So, yeah, I don't know why this section is called John's Portfolio of Diaries, because to me, as I say, it looks more like scrapbooks than diaries. But irrespective of that, I'm going to turn your attention to some of these cutouts in here of John's that are attributed to have belonged to John. The most glaringly prominent one of them all, perhaps, is this one here, 666. And as the accompanying caption states, next to that image of the 666, this image is lifted from the artwork of a prog rock album released in 1972 titled 666, The Apocalypse of John, and credited to the Greek prog rock band Aphrodite's Child. The lineup of this band, which wasn't around for very long. They existed for a few short years up until the early 70s. The lineup of this band featured keyboardist Evangelos Papathanasiou, who, after the band's breakup in the early 70s, became a hugely successful composer of movie soundtracks, including 1981's Chariots of Fire and 1982's Blade Runner. He's perhaps best known by another name that he went under, Vangelis. Vangelis, the man, the main driving force behind the 666 album, did say in interviews that this album, which was a concept album, was indeed based on the apocalypse of St. John from the New Testament in the Bible. One of the tracks on the album, The Four Horsemen, that was the title of it, makes references in its lyrics to what would appear to be the four horsemen of the apocalypse as described in the apocalypse of St. John in the Bible. The lyrics state from that particular song, the first horseman is white, the second red, the third black, and the fourth, the horseman of death, is green. Now, apocalypse, the actual word itself, as you may indeed know, can mean a couple of things. It can mean the end of the world, but it also means revelation, or in other words, disclosure, discovery, in other words. So what was it that attracted John to include this image of 666 from the Aphrodite's Child album in his so-called portfolio? Is it merely because he liked the album that much that he wanted to get his scissors out and cut out from the album and stick it in his diary, in his so-called portfolio? I seem to recall when I was a youngster a long time ago, I'm now a middle-aged man, but I remember when I was a teenager, and I'm not a father, I'm not a dad, so I don't know if kids do this these days. I don't know if teenage kids do this these days. My guess is they don't, but I seem to recall when I was a teenager, kids of my age at that time, what they used to do, if they had a favourite band or a singer, they used to get their scissors out and cut out pictures of their favourite band or favourite singer. If they saw them in a magazine or in a newspaper, if they saw them in a music magazine, for example, a picture of them or an article or whatever, an interview with their favourite band or singer, they would cut it out and stick it in a scrapbook. So I'm just wondering if that's what John was doing here on a much smaller scale. You know, he was just being a little bit of a fanboy. But another thought springs to mind. Was he being a bit of a fanboy, or, and this is just me throwing this out as a possibility, did he cut this out, this image, 666, from this particular album because he actually identified with the title of the album, with its reference to St. John? The album was released, so I'm led to understand, sometime in the spring of 1972. Now, at that point in time, John Lennon was immersed in so-called radical politics, participating in public events and protests, such as in December 1971. There was the John Sinclair benefit concert in the US. He took part in that. John Sinclair was a US activist who in 1969 was sentenced to 9.5 to 10 years in jail after, in his words, he was accused of, and I quote, in his words, having given 2 joints to an undercover policewoman just before Christmas 1966. Now, directly after Lennon's performance at this John Sinclair benefit concert in December of 71, Sinclair was actually freed. In February of 1972, Lennon took part in a demonstration in New York against British policy in Northern Ireland, which at the time was, to put it mildly, blighted by violence and terror attacks known as the Troubles, with one side of Northern Ireland wanting to remain under British rule and the other wanting to break away from it. And John was out demonstrating again in April and May of 1972, this time at anti-war demonstrations. Now, did John Lennon see himself as a sort of St. John of the apocalypse, a John Lennon of the apocalypse, or in other words, John Lennon of revelation, of disclosure, disclosing socio-political issues of great importance to the masses with the help of his hugely known name across the world. I don't know. I'm just putting it out there as a possibility. Also quite prominent in presence on this page, aside from the large 666 image, is the Eye of Horus there. The Eye of Horus, belonging to Horus, referred to as the ancient Egyptian god of the sky and kingship. He's depicted as a falcon. John Lennon and Yoko Ono. It's no huge secret that Yoko, if not John Lennon, invested time, energy and money in the pursuit of ancient Egyptian magic, as well as artefacts. Elliot Mintz, a former US radio DJ and TV presenter who befriended John and Yoko in the early 70s and became Yoko's official spokesman following John's death in 1980, recalls walking into the Lennons' apartment at the Dakota Building in New York in 1973 and noticing on his arrival a 3,000-year-old sarcophagus on display in a glass case in one of their rooms. To quote Elliot, who talked about this many years later, to quote him, John and Yoko had scored the very last mummy allowed out of Egypt before the Egyptian government put a ban on exporting their national antiquities. He also recalled looking back at that moment in 1973 when he witnessed this sarcophagus in the Lennons' apartment. He recalls talking to Yoko about it at the time back in 1973 and suggesting that maybe she should have it x-rayed to see if it contained anything within it, like something of great financial value, like precious jewels, trinkets, that kind of thing. To which Yoko replied, "No. The great value is the magic of the mummy itself." That's a direct quote there from Elliot Mintz as to Yoko's reply to that suggestion of his. And indeed, in 1980, in an interview, Yoko said, "To make money, you have to spend money. But if you're going to make money, you have to make it with love. I love Egyptian art. I make sure to get all the Egyptian things, not for their value, but for their magic power. Each piece has a certain magic power." And to quote from the book Lennon in America, 1971 to 1980, and based in part, it's claimed, on long-lost diaries of John Lennon's, the author of the book, Jeffrey Giuliano, writes about John and Yoko's trip to Egypt, instigated, he claims, by a guy by the name of Sam Green, an art curator and friend of Yoko's. To quote from the book, Sam Green learned from one of his colleagues about a clandestine archaeological dig being conducted in Egypt to unearth an ancient temple. The project, however, needed funding to complete the excavation. When Green relayed this news to Yoko, she could barely wire the money to Cairo fast enough and began planning a visit to the site. Lennon, too, excited by the prospect of an intercontinental hunt for artefacts, couldn't wait to get on the plane. At the same time, Yoko and Sam Green were finalising the details of a complicated plan to sidestep the Egyptian authorities. Because Egypt's ancient national treasures were under assault by international art poachers, its governmental authorities instituted safeguards to protect these sacred grave sites and even resorted to aerial searches to catch would-be raiders. Arriving in Cairo, the Lennons checked into the Nile Hilton. John took a nap before venturing into the city to purchase a wardrobe for the excavation. He ran into Thomas Hoving, former director of New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, who was in Cairo on his own expedition for art. An enraptured John spent his first night exploring one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Great Cheops Pyramid, built by Pharaoh Khufu, founder of the 4th dynasty, around 2680 BC. The next day, Lennon awoke energised and refreshed. An ardent history buff, he enthusiastically toured the pyramids at Saqqara, which he found even more fascinating than the Cheops site. As he explored the underground chambers, he ran his hands across the hieroglyphics and marvelled at the intricacy of the ancient artwork on the stone walls. Coming upon an open sarcophagus, Lennon was unable to resist the temptation and recklessly tore off a scrap of material as a souvenir. Only later did he wonder if his blasphemous action had incurred the mummy's curse. He was worried enough to call an emergency meeting with one of Yoko's mystics. While Lennon was exploring various sites, Yoko was finalising details for the proposed visit to the illicit excavation. The more intent she became, though, the more Sam Green feared her presence might cause problems. After all, an internationally known celebrity couple wasn't likely to go unnoticed by the Cairo authorities, so Green used Thomas Hoving as a means to discourage Yoko's plans. He concocted a story that the renowned art director had gotten word of their scheme for obtaining artefacts and stood prepared to alert the authorities himself unless all parties left Egypt immediately. Marlene Weiner, Yoko's psychic, confirmed the imagined threat. Yoko was concerned enough to abandon the plan. And here is Yoko and John in Egypt. Elsewhere, in the book John Lennon, A Biography, the author of the book, Jacqueline Edmondson, claims that John, according to what Sam Green recalled, and I quote, John believed he had lived in Egypt in a previous life. And this is perhaps the best place to mention veteran occult symbologist Robert Richard Hieronymus, PhD, someone who I've spoken with in conjunction with my sites, The Occult Beatles, and also Conspiro TV. I've spoken to him a couple of times over the years about his contention that The Beatles, the actual band name The Beatles, might have been unconsciously or consciously inspired by the lure of ancient Egyptian motifs, such as the insect, the scarab beetle, which in ancient Egypt was, in Hieronymus's words, a very, very sacred symbol, because scarabs roll large balls of dung to lay their eggs in, and that eventually hatch with their young from there, a behaviour that Egyptians saw as an act of spontaneous self-creation, and hence its association with the life-giving beetle-headed sun god Khepra, which has the body of a human and the head of a beetle, and who was said to be self-created, born of his own substance. Hieronymus has put forward the idea that the Beatles chose the name The Beatles, whether consciously or not, because it reflected what they were to accomplish as a band, the act of creation. As Hieronymus has also said, the scarab beetle was regarded as a symbol of rebirth because they lay their eggs in dung balls, which eventually hatch from there. So from dung, a waste product, comes life. And if you look at the Beatles timeline, whilst they operated as a working group between 1960 to 1970, this was indeed a group of almost constant rebirth, of reinvention. I mean, if you go back to the beginning of their career in 1960 as a band, in their pre-fame period, they were leather-clad rockers who played hard rock and roll in the clubs of Hamburg in Germany and in the clubs of Liverpool and the dance halls of Liverpool. And they were rather uncouth on stage as well. They were a raw, young rock band. They used to swear on the stage, they used to smoke cigarettes on the stage, lark around, joke around. And then their manager to be, Brian Epstein, came along and he cleaned them up. He got them out of the leathers, he got them wearing suits, he polished up their stage act. They were no longer allowed to swear on stage or to smoke or to joke around, to lark around. He got them all... He put this professional sheen on them, if you like. And the Beatles' drummer, who was their drummer during those hard-rocking pre-fame days, Pete Best, was sacked and replaced with Ringo Starr. And they became these cuddly, mop-top Beatles. And it was from this that we got the so-called Beatlemania years, the mop-top Beatle years, and they became... very mainstream in terms of their audience. They began to appeal to a cross-section of people, from toddlers right the way through to teenagers to grandparents. And then in 1967, they became the princes of psychedelic pop, especially with the release of their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which became the so-called soundtrack of the so-called Summer of Love. And then a couple of years after that, they did away with the Technicolor of the psychedelia, and they became more casual. They began to dress in jeans, they grew their hair longer, they grew beards, and they went back to their roots in a way. They began to play rock again as they neared the end of their time together as a band. But here's something else, and this takes us back to the earlier mentioned Horus. Here's what I mean. Khepra, the beetle-headed god, has been connected to the sun god Ra. To quote mystic scholar and 33rd degree Freemason Manly P. Hall from his book The Secret Teaching of All Ages, Ra, the god of the sun, as the creator of the universe, he was symbolised by the head of a scarab and was called Khepra, which signified the resurrection of the soul and a new life at the end of the mortal span. The scarab was the emissary of the sun. The sun god Ra, similar to Horus, is depicted with the body of a human and the head of a falcon. And then there's the deity Ra Horagdi, an amalgamation of Ra and Horus. And in his Book of the Law in 1904, Aleister Crowley, there he is again, wrote of the New Age of Horus, a period, he wrote, that began in that year, 1904, and that followed on first from the age of Egyptian god Isis, the mother of Horus, who presided when the universe was conceived. Next, beginning in 500 BC, came Osiris, the father, and then the son, Horus, who Crowley stated in 1904, and I quote, rules the present period of 2000, beginning in 1904. Everywhere his government is taking root. Observe for yourselves the decay of the sense of sin, the growth of innocence and irresponsibility, the strange modifications of the reproductive instinct with a tendency to become bisexual, the childlike confidence in progress combined with nightmare fear of catastrophe. Consider the outcrop of dictatorships, only possible when moral growth is in its earlier stages, and the prevalence of infantile cults like communism, fascism, pacifism, health crazes, occultism in nearly all its forms, religions sentimentalised to the point of practical extinction. Consider the popularity of the cinema, the wireless, in other words, the radio, all devices for soothing fractious infants. No seed of purpose in them. We are children. How this new aeon of Horus will develop, how the child will grow up, these are for us to determine. Critics of the 1960s counterculture would argue that it was indeed a time when there was a growth of irresponsibility and quote-unquote strange modifications of the reproductive instinct. The 1960s was the decade of the so-called permissive society and a push by the culture shifters of the time for society to abandon the traditional family unit. Certainly, the popularity of the radio, or more to the point, music, was prominent at the time, as was a growing interest in the occult, which gained popularity among the countercultural young during the mid to late 60s. Critics of the 1960s might also regard Crowley's quote-unquote decay of the sense of sin as a direct hit against the fading, plummeting popularity of Christianity among the young during the 1960s. As John Lennon stated, rightly or wrongly, in a newspaper interview in 1966 about his and the Beatles' popularity at the time, and I quote, "We're more popular than Jesus now. Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." It was a statement that he elaborated on at a press conference in the US that same year.
I was just talking to a reporter, but she also happens to be a friend of mine and the rest of us. At home, it was a sort of in-depth series she was doing. But I just meant it as that the Beatles, I wasn't saying the Beatles are better than Jesus or God or Christianity. I was using the name Beatles because I can use them easier, but I could have said TV or cinema or anything else that's popular, or motor cars are bigger than Jesus. But I just said Beatles because, that's the easiest one for me. I think that from what my views are, from what I've read or observed of Christianity and what it was and what it has been or what it could be, it just seems to me to be shrinking. I'm not knocking it or saying it's bad. I'm just saying it seems to be shrinking and losing contact.
And with that said, elsewhere in John's Mind Games book, we can see reference to Crowley's New Aeon in picture form. If you look here, you can see a picture, an illustration of what is Crowley's May Morn from 1919. That's the name of this painting. To quote from the Mind Games book, which in turn is quoting directly from the accompanying text that came with Crowley's painting, and I quote, "The picture is symbolical of the new aeon. From the blasted stump of the dogma, the poison oak of original sin, is hanged the hag with dyed and bloody hair. Christianity." Not quoted in the Mind Games book from the accompanying text to Crowley's painting is the following, and to quote again, "The shepherd and the nymph in the background represent the spontaneous outburst of the music of sound and motion caused by the release of the children of the new aeon from the curse of the dogma of original sin. Love is the law, love under will." Or, to quote the Beatles, can I say, "All you need is love." Is it just me? Or can the shepherd and the nymph in the background there be actually compared in physical likeness to 1960s hippies? So here are the hippies, the children of Crowley's New Aeon, unshackled from the so-called dogma of original sin. Moving on to the next page in John's portfolio of diaries here. Here's a picture, a photo collage by John Lennon, as it's described here, of John and Yoko, and that was included as a postcard that came free inside the packaging of John's Imagine album of 1971. The collage is adapted from an original painting from 1879 by German painter Arnold Böcklin, and is said to be depicting the god Pan playing his pipes to woodland nymphs. So similar perhaps to Crowley's flute-playing shepherd and nymph representation. So in Lennon's photo collage, we have John appearing as Pan, a god of ancient Greek mythology, regarded as a god of nature and music. So did John identify with this figure? Not only because of Pan's identification to music, but also of nature. Because one of the tracks on John's previously mentioned Imagine album is Jealous Guy, perhaps one of his best known solo songs. And it's actually... when it was released in 1971, at that point in time, it did have a long history behind it. It was a song a long time in the making. It actually harks back to John's time in the Beatles in the late 60s, to 1968, when it was known under its working title, Child of Nature. Pan is also regarded as a bit of a drinker who partied hard and lusted after ladies. And Pan is a satyr and a man with the legs of a goat. Now, up until reading the 2024 Mind Games book, I had no idea that this photo collage of John's existed, and I've been a Beatles fan most of my life. I'm now in my mid-50s, and I've been a fan since around the age of 5. So I'm a second-generation fan of the Beatles. Yeah, I've been a fan for most of my life, but I wasn't old enough to have been around when the Beatles were a working unit, when they were a working band. So I wasn't old enough to have purchased the Beatles music when they were together as a working group, and certainly not when John Lennon originally released the Imagine album in 71. I would have been 1-2 years old at the time. So maybe that's why I didn't recognise this photo collage when I saw it in the Mind Games book, because when I bought the Imagine album in the late 1980s, there was no postcard of this collage of John's. I don't know, I'm just guessing here, but maybe the collage was only included in those original 1971 pressings. I don't know, just a guess there. But I mean, there was a postcard actually in my late 1980s pressing, but not of that, but a different postcard. And you can see that postcard in the Mind Games book as well. It can be seen on the next page within John's so-called portfolio of diaries in the Mind Games book. Here it is. A photo of John holding onto a pig's ears. As the caption to it reads, this was John's cheeky parody of the front cover of Paul and wife Linda McCartney's Ram album, also released in 1971. And here's the actual cover of the Ram album. At the time of the release of Ram and Imagine in 1971, Lennon and McCartney were publicly taking swipes at each other, both of them still embroiled in bitter legal and financial disputes following the messy breakup of the Beatles. Interesting perhaps that John should have chosen to include a postcard in his Imagine album of him appearing as Pan, a half man, half goat, because in 1977 McCartney released an instrumental version of the Ram album under the name of Percy Thrillington, a fictional figure who we can see on the front cover of the album, a fictional figure with the body of a human and the head of a ram, so again half animal, half human. And this Thrillington figure reminds me a bit of Baphomet, the notorious horned god who's been adopted as a symbol by the Church of Satan. The illustration of Baphomet here was created in the mid-1800s by French occultist, magician and Freemason Eliphas Levi, and it was dubbed the Baphomet of Mendes. And now here's a quote from the website whitedragon.org with regards to that. Nectanebo had been a pharaoh in the 30th dynasty and had fought the Battle of Mendes, a town in the delta in Lower Egypt, now called Ashmun, with Artaxerxes II, his suzerain king of Persia, whom he had utterly defeated and together with his army expelled from the delta. Nectanebo forever after remained faithful to the local god. The town of Mendes was sacred to the worship of the god Min and the ram Mendes. This devotion Nectanebo took with him when he fled to Greece. His god was identified with Pan. When the Greek royal dynasty, the Ptolemies, ruled Egypt, Min was accepted as the Egyptian Pan, and the worship of the goat was conflated with that of the ram. This gave rise to the cult of the Goat of Mendes, infamous in the West as the incarnation of the devil, the age-old arch-rival to the slave masters of Christendom. In dynastic times, the soul of Osiris, father of Horus, I'll just add here, of course, was thought to be lodged in the sacred ram that was worshipped in the western delta town of Jedet and was known as Barneb Jedet, Ram Lord of Jedet, who remained a popular deity down to the Ptolemaic period. The Greeks garbled the last three syllables of Barneb Jedet's name into Mendes. Furthermore, according to the writings of ancient Greek historian Herodotus, and I quote, in the Egyptian language, Mendes is the name both for the he-goat and for Pan. So, in a nutshell, to summarise what I was saying there, basically, the ancient Egyptian town of Mendes worshipped the ram, right, and was later identified by the ancient Greeks with Pan, and the worship of the goat was amalgamated with that of the ram, and later this amalgamation of the ram and Pan was identified as the notorious Baphomet. Furthermore, the soul of Osiris's father was thought to be lodged in the ram. And okay, from another perspective, and maybe I'm reaching here, but anyway, I'm going to share this with you anyway. Considering the deep connections between Pan and the ram, this amalgamation, was there a conscious or unconscious attempt by Lennon and McCartney to amalgamate John's Pan on the Imagine album of 1971, you know, that postcard photo, to amalgamate John's Pan on the Imagine album, as I say, to that same year's release of McCartney's Ram, which was later, in later years, to manifest as the half-human, half-ram figure of Thrillington, Percy Thrillington. And keeping in mind Lennon's parody of McCartney's Ram album cover, that postcard photo I showed you earlier of John holding the pig, Herodotus also wrote that, and I quote, "Swine are held by the Egyptians to be unclean beasts." So, was this another dig by Lennon at McCartney with this postcard photo? Was this a dig by Lennon at McCartney at a time when the two of them weren't exactly seeing eye to eye? Just a thought. Flipping back a few pages in the Mind Games book to the tarot section, if you remember that, under the heading Lifting the Veil. The Devil tarot card here, this illustration of it was by illustrator Pamela Coleman Smith, published in 1910 as part of the Rider-Waite tarot deck. And in 1911 came a book explaining the deck, authored by Arthur Edward Waite, who explains in the book that the Devil card is, and I quote, the horned goat of Mendes. Waite was a Freemason, and both Waite and Coleman Smith are reported to have been members of the magical fraternity, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, as was Aleister Crowley, of course. Crowley, according to British writer Dennis Wheatley, author of the occult fictional novel The Devil Rides Out, of course, wrote about Crowley in his memoirs Drink and Ink, recalling, and I quote, "We had Crowley to dinner several times. His conversation was fascinating. He gave me much useful information and several of his books, but never attempted to draw me into his occult activities." For a considerable time, Crowley had ruled a community in northern Sicily. There is little doubt that cats were sacrificed there to the satanic powers. Then rumours got round that certain small children who had disappeared had been used for the same purpose. In any case, Crowley was expelled from Italy and went to Paris. There, one of his disciples owned a small hotel on the left bank. Crowley greatly wished to raise Pan, so the hotel proprietor got rid of his staff for the weekend, and Crowley's coven of disciples assembled there. The furniture from a room under the roof was removed and it was swept clean. In the evening, Crowley, in his magician's robes, went into it accompanied by Macalister, one of his disciples, and son of Aleister. He then told the other 11 members of the coven that whatever noises they might hear, in no circumstances were they to enter that room before morning. So the 11 went downstairs to a cold buffet, very nervous. A little after midnight they heard an appalling racket in the upper room, but obeyed the master's orders and did not go up. When in the morning they did go up, they knocked on the door, but there was no reply, so they broke it in. Both Macalister and Crowley had had their robes ripped from them and were naked. Macalister was dead, and Crowley a gibbering idiot crouching in a corner. Perhaps Crowley did succeed in raising Pan, and the horned god strongly objected to being taken away from whatever he was doing. Anyhow, Crowley spent 4 months in a loony bin outside Paris before he was allowed about again, but it may well be that he really was able to call down power before this bizarre event. The following report certainly suggests it. Flipping forwards a few pages in the Mind Games book, back to where we were before, under John's portfolio of diaries, there's cover art there. From the 1972 4th edition of The Art and Practice of the Occult, a book that the Mind Games caption here informs the reader is a book on exercises in Hermetic Kabbalah. If you read the book, The Art and Practice of the Occult, it states that its aim is to teach the reader, if they so wish, and to paraphrase here, a passable working knowledge of occult principles that can be applied to daily living. The book, The Art and Practice of the Occult, sets the reader practical lessons to learn in order to achieve this, such as learning to draw and colour basic symbols and to master their meanings as well, learning to prepare charts and magical instruments. And through this work, the book states, you gradually change your inner being into that of a Gnostic, and with this deeper and deeper knowledge comes power over nature. And I repeat, a day will come when you wake up and find you have some power over these phases of nature. And here, as the caption from the Mind Games book describes, this is cut from the front pages of the book, The Art and Practice of the Occult. John has drawn his signature doodle of his and Yoko's smiling faces inside. There are other books mentioned within the Mind Games book to highlight here in one shape or form. There's actually 4 pages dedicated to this under the banner John and Yoko's Library of Esoterica, a selection. Now, it's not entirely clear which of these books John would have read himself. He wouldn't have read all of them, as one or more of them were published after his death. And as to the ones published during his lifetime, it's not clear whether John and Yoko read them all, or whether John read them and Yoko didn't, or vice versa. There's no actual information here to within this book to give you any insight into that. Skimming through some of them here then, we have a book on palmistry, the tarot, Chinese fortune telling, numerology, actually quite a few books on numerology, and I'll come back to that later. There's also Satanism and Witchcraft, a study in medieval superstition by 19th century French historian Jules Michelet. Witchcraft in England, Stonehenge Decoded, a practical guide to Kabbalistic symbolism, volumes 1 and 2. Also, The Wisdom of the Kabbalah. There's a book on fasting, Lowering Your Pulse to Live Longer, a book on raw vegetable juices, and there's also a number of books on astrology. There's also this book, Crystal Gazing, Spiritual Clairvoyance Behind the Veil, The Trance Sleep, originally published in 1913, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe a couple of years after that. I haven't read it from page to page, but basically it gives the reader, it guides the reader in learning how to crystal gaze and also clairvoyance. It guides the reader in the art, if you like, of clairvoyance. The book was authored by American occult author L.W. DeLawrence. Yoko is known to have employed astrologers and psychics to guide her personal and business affairs. It's not much of a secret. I mean, she said so herself, and I mentioned it sometime earlier as well. Also, the earlier mentioned Elliot Mintz has recalled in his most recently released memoirs, We All Shine On, John, Yoko and Me, memoirs that came out in 2024. In those memoirs, he recalls that Yoko, and I quote, had a coterie of spiritual advisors, and they vetted virtually every decision Yoko made, from whom to do business with to what flight to take when they, John and Yoko, were travelling. In the Mind Games book, Yoko Ono claims actually that when she first met John in the 1960s, it was John who was into astrology, not her. And she mentions an astrologer to illustrate this. In the Mind Games book, she mentions an astrologer that John had hired for the Beatles company Apple, and who was, in her words, paid by the week. And what I find most interesting about this is that the astrologer John and his fellow Beatles had hired, and who was paid by the week, was a guy by the name of Rupert Ashburton Dunning, otherwise known as Caleb, a member of the very, very notorious Process Church of the Final Judgment, a religious group founded in London in the early 1960s by former Scientologists Mary and Robert de Grimston. Basically, its theology brought together Christ with Satan, and hence much criticism from concerned critics. This is something I have looked into in some depth in a previous podcast, actually, for the Magical Mystery Talk series of podcasts that I record with fellow researchers Mark Devlin and Desiree Hall. Desiree, of course, the proprietor of the blog, the Number 9 blog, the Beatles occult and conspiratorial flavoured Number 9 blog. If you want to go and listen to a little bit more about the Beatles and their links to the notorious Process Church of the Final Judgment, you'll hear me talking about it in episode 10 of the podcast series Magical Mystery Talk, which you can find on Conspiro TV and at my website, The Occult Beatles. In the Mind Games book, Yoko explains her reasons for using psychics to help her navigate hers and John's business issues. She says, John and I decided at one point that we would check a lot of things through astrology and psychics. The reason for getting psychic advisors instead of financial advisors was because we were suddenly finding ourselves in a reality that had no signposts. It was not on the map. John and my life was a totally different kind of life, so a usually conservative financial advice would not be applicable. We wanted an opinion that was transcending all that. We never wanted to be dependent on one psychic, so we'd always have 3 or 4 of them and double check and whatever. Whilst we're here within the realms of psychic reading, this is a good place to mention another book in John and Yoko's so-called Library of Esoterica, and that's 1971's How to Read the Aura by W.E. Butler. According to its promotional blurb, in clear-cut language, renowned parapsychologist W.E. Butler outlines simple procedures by which anyone can develop, perfect and control the 4 basic psychic powers that we all possess, using the strength of your intuition. Read the aura, perceive and understand the meaning of the glowing field of vital energy that surrounds all living beings. Understand psychometry. Read the emanations of all objects to learn their historical and emotional significance. Awaken your telepathic powers. Transmit and receive thoughts solely through your mind's power. Experience clairvoyance. See the past, the future, and the boundless present in vivid clarity. With these techniques, you can develop your higher faculties, enriching your own life and that of others, and enabling self-transformation on a new and deeply satisfying level. These tools open the path toward a lifetime of exploration and discovery. The British-born author and occultist W.E. Butler was head of Servants of the Light, a school that, it states on its website, supports students in finding their unique spiritual path by exploring the reality of the nature of their unique soul and spiritual identity. It goes on. We explore teachings about the human soul and its immortality or survival beyond physical death in the light of wisdom teachings from many epochs of human history, such as ancient Egyptian beliefs and myths, the sacred Kabbalistic teachings of Judaism, Hermetic Kabbalah, Orphic and ancient Greek, Platonic and Aristotelian teachings, Taoism, Chaldean and Zoroastrian philosophy, and astrological teachings. The school's roots, the Servants of the Light, this school, its roots go back to the beginning of the 20th century when Violet Mary Firth, otherwise known as Dion Fortune, founded the Society of Inner Light. Violet was also a member of the earlier mentioned Golden Dawn. Elsewhere in the Mind Games book, in this section, the Library of Esoterica, from 1977, there's the book ETI, Space Beings Intercept Earthlings. And to quote from the book here, the amazing true story of how ETI, short for, if I'm not mistaken, extraterritorial intelligence, the amazing true story of how ETI, space beings who have intervened at key times to direct the course of history, now return to deliver this planet into its new age, or heaven on earth. I'll take a guess here, and I might be wrong about this, of course, but it could be that John Lennon would have been interested in reading this book back in the late 70s, given his own said experience with what he claims to have been a UFO sighting whilst in his apartment in the New York borough of Manhattan. This was back in August of 1974.
Over here, up there, I saw a UFO, and it went down the river, turned right at the United Nations, turn left and then down the river. It wasn't a helicopter, it wasn't a balloon, and it was so near.
And it looked what, sort of round, white, luminescent, and silent?
Silent, and it looked dark, like black or grey in the middle, and had white lights, just looked like light bulbs, you know? Just going off, on, blink, 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 round the bottom, and on top was a red light.
At the time that he claims he saw the UFO, this UFO, he was estranged from Yoko and was in a relationship with his and Yoko's former secretary and assistant, May Pang. And she too has claimed on many occasions that she saw the UFO. For example, in 2011, she said, "I know what I saw. It was a UFO. I was so freaked out by it, and John was just taking it all in. We were not far from this thing. It was moving slowly. At times it would just sort of hover. There was no noise. I could hear the street noise below me, but the thing that was directly above my head had no noise. Nothing. We watched it go sideways, around the corner. It kept going up and up, further into the sky, and then it hovered. It sat there for a good few minutes, and it started to move. And then I watched it go straight up, and it was gone." John made mention of it in one of his last songs, Nobody Told Me, when he sings the line, "There's UFOs over New York, and I ain't too surprised." And while I'm at it here, another book in the Lennon Ono collection in the Library of Esoterica is Easy Journey to Other Planets, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. And to read a piece from that book, a living being, especially civilized man, has a natural desire to live forever in happiness. This is quite natural because in his original state, the living being is both eternal and joyful. However, in the present conditioned state of life, he is engaged in a struggle against recurring birth and death. Therefore, he has attained neither happiness nor immortality. The latest desire man has developed is the desire to travel to other planets. This is also quite natural because he has the constitutional right to go to any part of the material or spiritual skies. Such travel is very tempting and exciting because these skies are full of unlimited globes of varying qualities, and they are occupied by all types of living entities. The desire to travel there can be fulfilled by the process of yoga, which serves as a means by which one can transfer himself to whatever planet he likes, possibly to planets where life is not only eternal and blissful, but where there are multiple varieties of enjoyable energies. Anyone who can attain the freedom of the spiritual planets need never return to this miserable land of birth, old age, disease and death. One can attain this stage of perfection very easily by his individual effort. He can simply follow in his own home the prescribed method of Bhakti Yoga. This method, under proper guidance, is simple and enjoyable. An attempt is made herein to give information to the people in general and to philosophers and religionists in particular as to how one can transfer oneself to other planets by this process of Bhakti Yoga, the highest of all yogic processes. Elsewhere in the book, one can attempt to go to any planet he desires, but this is only possible by psychological changes in the mind or by yogic powers. Mind is the nucleus of the material body. Anyone who trains the mind to turn from matter to the spiritual form of the Godhead by performance of Bhakti Yoga can easily attain the kingdom of God in the anti-material sky. Of this, there is no doubt. And some images here from the book. Here's one. And another. The caption underneath there reads, "Master yogis can give up their bodies at will and enter the anti-material worlds, while the gross materialists cannot even approach the higher material planets with their space vehicles." Quite a number of books listed in John and Yoko's Library of Esoterica deal with Zen Buddhism and Eastern traditions in general. self-help and improvement is a common theme in the collection of books from John and Yoko's Esoteric Library selection. There's The Art of True Healing, The Unlimited Power of Prayer, published, if I'm not mistaken, in 1937 and authored by Israel Regardie. In its introduction, Israel informs the reader that his book sets out, and I quote, "the methods by which the dynamic nature of the subconscious can be stimulated so that the human personality becomes transformed into a powerful magnet, attracting to itself whatever it truly desires or is necessary to its welfare." He goes on in the book that within every man and woman is a force, a spiritual force that directs and controls the entire course of life, and if properly used can heal every affliction and ailment we may have. To quote him, "every molecule of our physical system is soaked with the dynamic energy of this force. Every cell in our body contains it in abundance." But the problem is, he argues, we're not aware of this. We've subconsciously blocked it from it working for us, largely due to the way we've been brought up and our false perceptions of the nature of life. To reverse this and to benefit from the force that Regardie talks about is to change our perception of life. He encourages the reader to become aware of one's energy centres in the body, to awaken them and direct them around the body so that they may function properly, using focused and rhythmic breathing, visualization, meditation and humming or intoning sounds in order to achieve this. I'm explaining this in oh so basic terms, I really am, but in the book, Regardie guides the reader through what's known as the middle pillar exercise, derived, so I'm informed, from the previously mentioned, here we go again, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. In fact, Regardie was a member of the order's offshoots, the Stella Matutina and the Alpha A Omega, as was Aleister Crowley, here we go again, who Regardie had worked as a secretary for a couple of years back in the late 1920s when Regardie was in his early 20s. The two became friends, although they later had a falling out. Regardie, who died in 1985, is considered an adept, a top-tier authority on the teachings of the Golden Dawn. Transcendental meditation, Zen Buddhism, ancient Indian history. There's quite a few books on such subjects within this area in John and Yoko's Esoteric Library, and I think this is a good place to mention another book in that selection. This one, Madame Blavatsky, Priestess of the Occult, by Gertrude Williams and published in 1946. Yes, there she is in John and Yoko's library, Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society in 1875. To quote from the back of the book, Madame Helena Blavatsky was one of the great female rebels, a spiritualist, a medium, a seer. She founded Theosophy, a metaphysical cult that attracted hundreds of thousands of members. One of the true eccentrics, she was denounced as a faker and worshipped as an oracle. In the course of her incredibly bizarre lifetime, she left a trail of devoted followers, bewitched lovers, complicated lawsuits, broken promises, wide-eyed converts, seers, swamis and yogis who fell under her magnetic spell. To quote from So I'm Led to Understand, one of Blavatsky's works, her aim was to, and I quote, to study the philosophies of the East, those of India chiefly, presenting them gradually to the public in various works that would interpret exoteric religions in the light of esoteric teachings. Blavatsky, born in Ukraine to family with roots to the Russian aristocracy, died in 1891 on Avenue Road in St John's Wood, London, the borough of London where some 71 years later the Beatles would go on to record most of their hit songs at Abbey Road in St John's Wood, London, thus helping the Beatles to build enough popularity and influence to successfully promote those philosophies of the East to so-called Western audiences through their adoption of transcendental meditation with guidance from the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Coincidence? Many would say that. Others won't, though, of course. And this is something I've looked at into some depth in an article on my site, The Occult Beatles, in an article titled One for the Road. I've also spoken about it in an episode of Magical Mystery Talk, in which I talk about allegations that the Maharishi was actually a secret intelligence asset who was put out there amongst the 60s countercultural scene to push Eastern philosophies, to encourage the 60s youth to focus on looking inward through meditation instead of engaging in effective protest against their governments and the Vietnam War. And I hope to look into all of this in a lot more detail in a future video presentation, which I'm currently putting together. Another book in John and Yoko's so-called esoteric library is The Myth of God Incarnate, published in 1977. It's a compilation of essays edited together around a common theme, that Jesus Christ was not, as the Bible tells us, God incarnate. To quote from the preface of the book, "It is clear to the writers of this book, as to a great many other Christians today, that Christianity has throughout its history been a continuously growing and changing movement. As a result, its theology has developed an immense range of variation as the Church has passed through successive historical periods and responded to widely different cultural circumstances. Indeed, as T.S. Eliot said, Christianity is always adapting itself into something which can be believed. The writers of this book are convinced that another major theological development is called for in this last part of the 20th century. The need arises from growing knowledge of Christian origins and involves a recognition that Jesus was, as he is presented in Acts 2:21, a man approved by God for a special role within the divine purpose, and that the latter conception of him as God incarnate, the second person of the Holy Trinity living a human life, is a mythological or poetic way of expressing his significance for us. This recognition is called for in the interests of truth, but it also has increasingly important practical implications for our relationship to the peoples of the other great world religions." And to quote from the opening chapter of one of the essays in the book by Anglican priest and academic Maurice Wiles, Christianity is often described as an incarnational faith. The phrase may be understood in a looser or a stricter sense. The looser meaning characterises Christianity as a religion in which man's approach to God is through the physical world rather than by escape from it. In its narrower sense, it constitutes a description of Christianity as a faith whose central tenet affirms the incarnation of God in the particular individual, Jesus of Nazareth. The question that I shall be asking in this chapter is whether incarnational faith in this second, more precise sense is in fact essential to Christianity. Could there be a Christianity without, in this sense, incarnation? All of this reminds me of a book that John Lennon is said to have read around the time of his infamous Beatles Bigger Than Jesus comments back in 1966, that book being The Passover Plot by Hugh J. Schonfield. I must confess that I haven't read that book, The Passover Plot. I haven't read it from page to page, but from what I'm led to be informed, and please do forgive me if I'm wrong, in that book it's claimed that the resurrection of Jesus after dying on the cross was something of a false flag. In other words, in seeking to cement his reputation as the expected Messiah that everyone had been waiting for, Jesus put together a plan with the help of his disciples to fake his death on the cross so that when he was quote unquote resurrected, it would appear to all that he was indeed the chosen one, this Messiah. This, so I'm led to understand, would have been achieved. How they would have achieved this, how Jesus and his disciples would have achieved this, was by lacing water that was given to Jesus on the cross to quench his thirst with a drug that made him appear as though he was dead. So when they cut him down from the cross, everyone thought he was dead, but he wasn't. It just made him look like he was dead, so that when he recovered from this substance that had been put in the water and he came back into consciousness, it made it look to everybody who was unknowing to the plot that basically he'd come back from the dead. Looking back at his Beatles bigger than Jesus comments some decades after the event, or a decade or so I should say after the event, John Lennon said in passing that the furor that these comments had caused back in 1966 had ended up with him being labelled as a quote-unquote Satanist. And indeed, decades after his death, a number of bloggers, podcasters, researchers have echoed this. And to add to that, back in the day, the Beatles' long-time trusted PR man, Derek Taylor, once stated that the Beatles were completely antichrist. And I'm quoting him here, completely antichrist. I mean, I'm antichrist as well, Derek Taylor said, but they're so antichrist, they shock me, which isn't an easy thing. Well, there you go. Believe John Lennon or not, and as you will have seen and heard earlier, back in 1966, John claimed that his Beatles bigger than Jesus comments were not intended to be a dig at, as he put it, God as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. He was merely describing, according to his own perceptions of the UK at the time, that church attendances were dwindling, which was actually a fact at the time. It has to be said. And I'll mention just a couple more books from John and Yoko's esoteric selection before moving on for a while. I'll return later, but I'm going to move on in a while. But before I do that, the first of those books I want to mention is Sugar Blues from the 1970s, authored by US journalist William Dufty. It comes down hard on the effects of sugar on the human body and its role in society as a whole in human history, how it fueled the slave trade, fomented wars between nations and destroyed people's health and their ability to function. Dufty, the author of the book, was inspired to write it by his then future wife, the veteran Hollywood movie actress Gloria Swanson, who, so I'm led to understand, was adopting a strict healthy food diet as far back as the 1920s when she was a silent movie star. She referred to sugar as quote-unquote poison and would openly admonish people who she saw consuming it in front of her. John Lennon, who it said became friendly with Swanson, was inspired by Sugar Blues enough to buy multiple copies, which he then gave to his friends. To quote from Sugar Blues, like opium, morphine and heroin, sugar is an addictive, destructive drug, yet Americans consume it daily in everything from cigarettes to bread. If you're overweight or suffer from migraine, hyperglycemia or acne, the plague of the Sugar Blues has hit you. Dufty was also responsible for another of John's favourite books, and that's also featured in John and Yoko's esoteric library selection, the English translation of You Are All Sanpaku, originally published in Japanese by its author George Oshawa. It promotes the macrobiotic diet, which John was adopting in the later stages of his life. Predominantly, according to the book, the diet, this particular diet, relies on whole grains, cereals, fish, and selected vegetables. Sanpaku, according to the book, is a condition in which the white of the eye can be seen between the pupil and the lower lid, a condition which connotes a grave state of spiritual and physical illness, and an extraordinary susceptibility to disease, accidents, and tragic death. Macrobiotics is the simple, natural means of avoiding or correcting this dangerous condition. Okay then, moving on. A sizable amount of the Mind Games book focuses on John Lennon's involvement in so-called radical politics and campaigning during the early 1970s. This aspect of his life had been simmering away initially since around 1966 during his days as a Beatle, when he began to voice his opposition to the Vietnam War, but his anti-war stance really picked up a pace in 1969 when he and Yoko participated in a non-violent publicity stunt that they declared to promote world peace, which consisted of them sitting in bed for a week and inviting the world's press to come and talk to them about it. John and Yoko took part in 2 of these bed-ins for peace, one in Amsterdam and another in Montreal, Canada, where they recorded the John-penned anthem Give Peace a Chance, which not that long later, in November 1969, was sung by protesters outside the White House when an estimated 500,000 demonstrators participated in the Vietnam Moratorium Day in Washington. Initially, John's public peace campaigns were apolitical, but by the time he moved from the UK to the US in 1971, he rapidly became more radical in his stance, aligning himself with US activists such as Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman, and the Black Panthers leader Bobby Seale. These associations eventually led to Lennon being surveilled by the FBI, while the US government, with the backing of then President Richard Nixon, began proceedings to have him deported from the US. But desperate to remain in the country, John in 1973 hired a lawyer to fight against this. The lawyer's name was Leon Wilds, and he advised John and Yoko to back away, to back off from the radical politics and the likes of Rubin and Hoffman, who, it's claimed, were actually secretly working for the CIA. This is an allegation that was bandied around at the time, and which is every now and again documented in various books up until this day. So Lennon acquiesced. He took heed of his lawyer's advice and he backed off as advised. And a few years later, in 1975, he won the deportation battle and was able to live in the US hassle-free. In 1980, after a brief hiatus from the music industry, Lennon was back with a new album, his first in 5 years, and also plans to participate in a workers' rally and march in San Francisco, protesting for the rights of striking workers of a Japanese food distributor and producer. And this would have been the first time he'd involved himself in protest since backing off back in 1973 on the advice of his lawyer back then, Leon Wilds. But he never made it to the rally because he was shot dead before that happened. The victim, perhaps, of an assassination by the then incoming US government, headed by President-to-be Ronald Reagan and his Vice President-to-be, the notorious George Bush, former boss of the CIA and alleged accomplice in the shooting of John F. Kennedy as well. Is that why Lennon was shot? To silence him from getting back out there into the arena of protest after backing off back in 1973? Well, some might disagree with that, arguing that he was just another false hero, an actor playing out a role, a shill playing out a role courtesy of the so-called powers that be. After all, he was once the member of the Beatles, social engineers of the 1960s, right? But this is only a suggestion, okay? But what if somewhere along the line he decided that he didn't want to play that game anymore, that social engineering game? What if he was hit with a smack of conscience, and decided that he wanted to atone for his major role in the social engineering of a generation, maybe by putting himself out there as a campaigner for peace and a critic of prominent politicians and their machinations? Maybe he thought he could use his worldwide influence that he'd been given for a greater good instead of using it to socially engineer. The Nixon administration had put the frighteners on him for that, for his campaigning. They threatened him with deportation, as I said, and he had the FBI tailing him as well. So maybe that's worth considering. Maybe he was genuinely out there fighting for good. He might have been compromised. For example, this if he was genuinely fighting for a greater good, there are sort of signs, if you like, that maybe he had been compromised. He was being compromised in order to discredit that genuine attempt on his part. For example, by being persuaded to take part in displays of activism that, unbeknown to him, were actually designed to make him look foolish, and as a result were intended to damage his credibility and his message. For example, there's a track, if you can call it that, on Lennon's Mind Games album. It's 4 seconds long, and it's titled The Utopian International Anthem. It's nothing but 4 seconds of silence. Utopia, to quote John and Yoko, and as mentioned at some length in the Mind Games book, actually, is a quote-unquote conceptual country. And John and Yoko, in Yoko's words, announced its founding to the world at a press conference in 1973. Joining John and Yoko at the press conference was Leon Wilde, who was also there himself. He was there to reveal to the press the then current stage in John and Yoko's legal bid to remain in the US. At the press conference, John and Yoko read out the Declaration of Utopia, and I quote, this was their declaration, and I quote, "We announce the birth of a conceptual country, Utopia. Citizenship of the country can be obtained by declaration of your awareness of Utopia. Utopia has no land, no boundaries, no passports, only people. All people of Utopia are ambassadors of the country. As two ambassadors of Utopia, we ask for diplomatic immunity and recognition in the United Nations of our country and its people." The fact that this public announcement was made on April 1st might give one some clue as to the sentiment behind this idea of utopia. John says it was announced on that date as a response to a press conference held by the US immigration people a week earlier in their bid to have Lennon thrown out of the state. So in other words, the utopian announcement on April the 1st was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek dig at US immigration, at the authorities. However, John also claimed that utopia was a concept not of his, but of Yoko's, a concept that she'd had, in John's words, to paraphrase him, hanging around for years waiting for the right opportunity to be used. It was, John said, something that came out of Yoko's conceptual art, where the idea is more important than the object. Yes, Yoko, as you might know, before meeting John, had established herself as an artist within the world of the avant-garde. She liked to play with perceptions in her works. For example, in 1967, one of her works was Half a Room, a room full of half-cut furniture, so half a table, half a bed, and so on. But when this kind of thing is presented to the world at a press conference where an immigration lawyer is appearing at the conference in order to fight your case for remaining in your country of choice, wasn't there a danger that this message that this lawyer was trying to make, that Leon Wilde was trying to make, would have been lost, wouldn't have been taken seriously, would have lost its importance, even if the Declaration of Utopia's unveiling at the press conference was meant to be a touch of parody, as John claimed? Who, if any, of the reporters and journalists present at the press conference got that joke? What if they didn't realise that it was meant to be a parody? This utopian idea of Yoko's potentially could have damaged John Lennon's renowned reputation at the time as an activist to be taken seriously, as an activist of merit. This concept of Yoko's, so said John, is a concept, to quote John here, and kind of mirroring what he stated earlier in his declaration of Utopia, this is a concept that has no land, there's nothing to fight for, there's no boundaries, there's no lines to be drawn, no passports, only people. It's a concept that you could say can be heard in Lennon's 1971 song Imagine, in the lines, "Imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one." Of course, as you may already be aware, cynics of the song and Lennon, of which you yourself might well be, regard Imagine as a New World Order promoting anthem, what with it imagining a world as one with no countries. In the Mind Games book, John is quoted as saying sometime in the 1970s, "I love New York. It's the hottest city on earth, and I like the multiracial thing over here. It's like living in Europe with Britain really in the common market, like Europe might be in 20 years or something. People coming and going all the time, crossing the borders. No land, no boundaries, no passports, only people." The common market that John was referring to there is now what we call the EU, the notorious European Union. And I'm guessing from the way John was talking there, from that quote I've given you, that he was talking pre-1973, because 1973 was the year Britain really entered the common market. The common market had been in operation since the 1950s. So, with all that said, would John have been a fan of the EU? What would he have made of Britain's vote to leave via Brexit in 2016? And that officially commenced at midnight on January 31st, 2020. Here's something. In 2017, an EU commissioner, Donald Tusk, whilst chairing a meeting of EU leaders who were lamenting Britain's decision to leave the EU, channeled the Imagine song. He channeled the Imagine song to make his point, quoting the lyric from the song, "You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one."
Some of my British friends have even asked me whether Brexit could be reversed and whether I could imagine an outcome where the UK stays part of the EU. I told them that, in fact, the European Union was built on dreams that seemed impossible to achieve. So, who knows? You may say, I am a dreamer, but I am not the only one. Thank you.
Ha ha ha, yes. Dark. There's something dark about that. In the years after John's shooting, Imagine has been adopted by the United Nations as a one world friendly anthem for one campaign or another. And I think it's safe to assume that Yoko, the beneficiary and head of the Lennon estate and legacy, would have okayed this. She would have been cool with this. She would have allowed the song to be used in this way. I'm just guessing here, but I'm guessing that an organisation such as the United Nations would not be able to use this song, Imagine, in the way that it has over the years, unless it could get the thumbs up from the John Lennon estate headed by Yoko. But would John have been cool with allowing organisations such as the UN and the EU to use the song for their own ends if he were here? Would he have been cool with this? Well, he's not here. Yoko is, and she was the one in control after her husband's shooting. And so that's the point I'm trying to make here, that I've been trying to make for the last few minutes. Has John Lennon's image been compromised after his death? Was he compromised during life, and has that continued after his death? Has his image been changed in order to suit the globalist friendly agenda? Well, here's something else to consider, with that question just hanging for a little bit. Initially, when Imagine was released, the songwriting credits of it went solely to John Lennon, but decades later, it's now co-credited to John and Yoko, because some years after its release, John himself said he revealed that the song was actually inspired by Yoko, by words from her book from 1964, a book titled Grapefruit, in which she, in her words, instructs the reader to imagine scenarios. I'll give you some examples from the book, from Grapefruit. There's this. It's called Tuna Fish Sandwich Piece. Imagine 1,000 suns in the sky at the same time. Let them shine for 1 hour. Then let them gradually melt into the sky. Make one tuna fish sandwich and eat. And another one from Grapefruit. This one is called Drinking Piece. Imagine letting a goldfish swim across the sky. Let it swim from the west to the east. Drink a litre of water. Imagine letting a goldfish swim across the sky. Let it swim from the east to the west. And this one. Imagine the clouds dripping. Dig a hole in your garden to put them in. John, it's said, for all his intelligence and razor-sharp wit, which he was famous for, and which he remains to this day, which he's still famous for. It's said, for all that intelligence and razor-sharp wit, John was also naive and easily led, which is something that's also been well documented over the years. So if he was indeed compromised, it wouldn't have been too difficult to lead him astray, especially if the person or persons doing the leading were close to him. In the past, in 1 or 2 podcasts, I've discussed the possibility that John Lennon might have been the victim of MK-type mind control. This could have been another way of leading him along. And with that in mind, in the earlier mentioned esoteric library section of John and Yoko's, in the Mind Games book, is the book The Primal Scream, Primal Therapy, The Cure for Neuroses. This was published in 1970. Primal Therapy was the creation of the book's author, American psychologist and psychotherapist Arthur Yanov. Now, to give you a basic overview, according to Yanov's description, primal therapy, takes the patient back to their early years, to relive an episode from their early life or a number of experiences from that time, or a trauma. It makes them relive a trauma from their early years, a trauma that caused them hurt or mental pain, because Yanov he contended that when that pain and trauma is, in his words, held in storage within one's self, it causes tension and anxiety and depression, and also physiological disorder. Yanov's primal therapy, he claimed, could free people of that pain by reliving it. Lennon was sent a copy of the book on its release, and he instantly wanted to undergo treatment with Yanov. After reading it, he hoped to free himself of childhood hurt that he said was caused by the trauma brought about by the separation and abandonment of both his parents. So that's what happened. Initially, the treatment began in Britain before going on to the US. Now, of course, I might be wrong, but having rummaged around in the depths of conspiracy research for a good few years now, I do have some suspicions when I look at John's brief entry, which it was, his brief entry into primal therapy. I do look at that episode in his life and see possible clues of mind control. Now, there's this article that Yanov appears in from 1971, an article for Rolling Stone magazine under the title The Primal Doctor. And this rings off alarm bells for me in the regards of with regards to mind control. Now, in this article for Rolling Stone, it takes us inside Yanov's Primal Institute in West Hollywood, where one of the rooms that was used at the time for his primal therapy in the article is described as a padded copper-lined cell. And Yanov in the article says it serves as a dungeon. 20 minutes in there, in the dark, with no sound and nothing to touch, and that's it. No more defences. To quote some more from the article, the mechanics of primal therapy are unorthodox. Prospective patients are not interviewed, but accepted on the basis of handwritten autobiographies. And when they are accepted, they are told to check into a hotel room 24 hours before their first session with Yanov, a therapist, begins. In that hotel room, he is to remain isolated. No telephone, no visitors, nothing to read, and no cigarettes, alcohol or drugs for the remainder of his therapy. He may additionally be asked to remain awake the full 24 hours so that when he reports the following day, suffering, Yanov says, his defences will have been lowered by fatigue. This procedure may be repeated over the next 3 weeks of therapy, or use may be made of the Institute's dungeon. For the patient, this is a painful period. It hurts in the telling, the reliving, and it hurts in the techniques employed by primal therapists in getting those experiences told. When one of the long-haired young men on the staff punches the patient in the stomach to halt neurotic breathing, or brutally squeezes the muscles of the shoulders and neck to get the tension out, well, I hurt people, Yanov says simply. I need access to the pain centres in the brain to get at the primal pains. The pain channels need to be opened, so I dig in. Back into his childhood the patient goes, often reliving his earliest years with such clarity he is reduced to a baby's vocabulary and lisp. Sometimes he even relives his birth, and sooner or later, Yanov claims, comes the cry for mummy and daddy and the first of the primal screams.
This is a group session in primal therapy. The idea is to go back, uncover the hurts of childhood. Shoot it!
Just the fact that the patients you see are crying is very important, because crying is really restoring a natural function of the body, you know. So just that alone is kind of curative, to give people back their tears.
I didn't want to be nice, Mama!
What you see here, this happening, you probably won't believe, happens every single day at the Primal Institute, almost every day in the year. We have groups every day. We have 8, 9, 10, 12 therapists working at a time, helping patients into their feelings. And as you can see, it's unlike any other group therapy known in the history of psychology. And it's based on a very simple idea, namely that people do not confront each other in group therapy. They confront themselves, the selves that are locked up inside of them.
What did you want, Mama? What did you want me to be? I wasn't a bad boy. I wasn't a bad boy.
What you see is each patient deeply into his own feelings, quite apart from whatever else is going on. I mean, people are reliving, as you see Pat on the floor, reliving pre-verbal material, scenes that happened to her at the age of 2. The scene that has all of this agony that she is reliving on the floor is a rape scene by her father at the age of 2. She was raped, bloody, and almost murdered. And she will have that primal dozens and dozens of times because the load of pain is so intense it could not possibly be relived in one setting.
Honestly, the thing was that I see my father. The thing was that my father, he raped me, and he raped me like, and I was all bloody, and I was all bloody all over here, and also in the asshole. I was just totally, and this is where my mother found.
For me personally, watching that, the trawling back to childhood and before to scrape out forgotten, blanked out trauma in order to relive it, as John Lennon is said to have been put through during his so-called primal therapy. Well, I can't help but compare this to methods of mind control that are said to have been inflicted on trauma-based victims of government and intelligence-based secret projects such as MKUltra, and I'll come back to this in just a minute or so. So, as you might know, the result of John's primal treatment was laid bare, literally, in the lyrics and music on his first post-Beatles solo album, released in 1970 at John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, a collection of tracks stripped raw, free from multi-layered instrumentation and poetic prose, famously characteristic in a lot of his work with the Beatles. And perhaps it's the song Mother from the album that is most primal, when he screams for his mother and father, begging them not to go at the very top of his voice, almost shredding it in the process. John's backing group for this primal album featured his old friend from the Beatles' pre-fame days in the clubs of Hamburg, Klaus Voormann. He played bass on the album, and Ringo is on drums. Ringo is quoted as saying that he found the recording sessions for the album a disturbing experience because he's quoted as saying, "Suddenly we'd be in the middle of a track and John would start crying or screaming, which freaked us out at the beginning." Voormann is quoted as saying that Ringo was very sad because the old John had gone. It was a different John. It wasn't the old one he was used to. A different John, not the old one. I find that interesting, and it brings me back to MKUltra as far as I'm concerned. The previously mentioned MKUltra, a once totally top secret government, military and intelligence based project which became public knowledge. I think it was somewhere around 1977 after top secret CIA documents were discovered. Alleged victims of such operations have come forward over the decades to detail the experiments, often trauma-based experiments that were carried out on them by the intelligence services in order to split their personality into different sections, or what's known as alters, so that each or some of these alters could be used to carry out tasks, missions, in other words, on behalf of their controllers. But of course, if you were to talk to regular folk about this kind of thing, this kind of subject matter, if you were to bump into regular folk on the street and talk about this kind of thing with them, at best they might laugh at you and call you a quote-unquote conspiracy theorist and tell you to put a tinfoil hat on your head. But within the realms of theory, quote-unquote, there are some hardcore facts when it comes to this kind of subject matter. And And indeed, there is, generally speaking, a shared consensus within the mainstream profession of mental health that childhood trauma can lead to the victim experiencing dissociation as a way of coping with it, or escaping from it as the years pass. A psychological mental condition referred to as dissociative identity disorder, a condition that can make the person experiencing it feel, sense, as though they have more than one person inside them. They may have a sense that some behaviours and memories and sensations don't belong to them, but to this someone else that's inside them. To quote from the NHS, the UK's publicly funded government-backed National Health Service, dissociative identity disorder, DID, used to be called multiple identity disorder. Someone diagnosed with DID may feel the presence of other identities, each with their own names, voices, personal histories and mannerisms. Someone with a dissociative disorder may have experienced physical, sexual or emotional abuse during childhood. Looking back at some of the imagery of the primal therapy sessions of years gone by, such as this from an old news report from 1970. This is from Yanov's Primal Institute, an image from his Primal Institute. This is an old baby's cot, or crib, as you might call it, of course, all boarded up, signifying perhaps damage. Anyone looking at this right now, if you're looking at this right now, you might recognise it as a particularly familiar motif in occult symbolic imagery pertaining to MK-Ultra type mind control, as are dolls, which, although human-like, dolls are human-like, but of course they're not human. They look human, but they're not. So you could say that's a symbol of disassociation, right? And the reason that I'm mentioning dolls, because in the Mind Games book, there are photos of John, for some reason, with dolls featured. Here we are. As you might know, in previous podcasts over the years, I've put forward the possibility that John was perhaps a victim of mind control. I've talked about the hold that Yoko Ono had over him, whether alleged or not. And when John and Yoko first got together, John was married at the time to Cynthia, the mother of his child Julian, and she'd been his girlfriend back in Liverpool, back in his pre-fame days. And yeah, when Cynthia walked into their family home one day in 1968 and found Yoko in her bedroom with John, that was it. That was pretty much the end of their marriage. Upon witnessing this, she pretty much turned around and walked out of the house. The marriage, as I say, had pretty much come to its end at this point. Anyway, sometime later, she returned with her mother. Cynthia returned to the house with her mother, to this house that not that long before had been her home with her husband and son. And again, there was Yoko. And Cynthia described this scene in her book, John. When we walked in, she recalled, I barely recognised John. It had only been a few weeks since we'd last met, but he was thinner, almost gaunt. His face was deadly serious. There was no hint of a smile. He was quite simply not the John I knew. It was as if he'd taken on a different persona. Yoko was beside him in the armchair, shrouded by her hair, her face set in an expressionless mask. God, what power did she have over him? Now, at the time that this is said to have happened, that this event, this incident that Cynthia describes is said to have happened, Yoko was also married, but estranged from a guy by the name of Anthony Cox. Anthony and Yoko eventually divorced in early 1969, and Anthony moved to Denmark. He got married to a lady by the name of Melinda. both Yoko and Anthony have some interesting backgrounds, as you may know, especially with regards to Yoko. Born in Japan, descended from so-called elite stock. On her mother's side, Yoko's great-grandfather was a samurai and so-called self-made billionaire. He founded the Yasuda Bank, one of the largest Japanese banks, which later became the Fuji Bank Limited. And at the age of 82, he was shot dead, assassinated, a political assassination, it's reported, in protest at the corrupting influence of business on government. Her father had a high-rank position at the Yasuda Bank and is reported also to have been a descendant of an emperor of Japan. Now, sometime around the late 50s, early 60s, Yoko attempted suicide and was admitted to a psychiatric institution in Japan. And Anthony Cox, it's claimed that Anthony broke her out of there by posing as an American doctor, making his way into the institution, claiming he was an American doctor, there to formally release Yoko from the institution. So yeah, he effectively, it said, broke her out of there by pretending to be a doctor. They got married in 1963, and yeah, as I say, Anthony's got a very interesting background. Very interesting history. You might even say a very shady, dark history. He was friends with a guy by the name of Donald Hamrick, who was leader of what was called the Harbingers Commune. This was in California. The Harbingers Commune was based in California, and it was formed sometime in the late 1960s. And Hamrick has been described as being a quote-unquote scientist UFO evangelist. Now, it's been claimed, it's been alleged that Hamrick was actually secret intel, working covertly for the CIA in conjunction with the FBI for the MK Ultra-linked, yes, there it is again, MK Ultra-linked project Operation Chaos, which was set up to spy, monitor, infiltrate and collect data on various protest groups and organisations during the late 60s and early 70s, groups that had been protesting against Vietnam and protesting for peace. And it was sometime around 1970 that John got to meet this notorious Hamrick through Anthony Cox. Now, what happened was, in December 69, if I'm not mistaken, the then recently married John and Yoko came to visit Anthony Cox and his wife Melinda at their home in Denmark. And it was whilst they were visiting in Denmark in 1970 that John, as I say, met Hamrick through Cox, who introduced them. And apparently, so I'm led to understand, during this meeting, Hamrick told Lennon, he told John that he could hypnotise him into quitting smoking. Now, John has spoken about this in public. He actually spoke about this hypnosis session with Hamrick in an interview, would you believe? And according to John, in this interview, Hamrick failed in his attempt to hypnotise him. Now, I don't know what John actually meant by that. I'll take a guess. I think what John was implying there was that Hamrick failed in his bid to hypnotise John into quitting his smoking habit. Because indeed, if you look throughout the 1970s and indeed right up until John's death in December 1980, John didn't stop smoking. There's more than enough evidence of that in photographs and film footage and what have you. Now, during this interview where John described this hypnosis session, this meeting with Hamrick, during this interview, John describes how whilst Hamrick was attempting to, according to John, attempting to hypnotise him, whilst this was happening, whilst this was going on, suddenly two people burst into the room, and this got John all jumpy, a bit nervous, scared even. And John describes how one of those two people that burst into the room was, quote unquote, a magician who, in John's words, was there, quote unquote, to put spells on everybody. Now keep that scenario in your head for a moment. Just hang on to that. I'm going to turn your attention briefly to something else. I'm going to turn your attention to a very, very controversial biography that came out in 1988. A very, very controversial biography on John Lennon. It's titled The Lives of John Lennon. It was authored by Albert Goldman. Now, in this book, this very, very controversial book, Donald Hamrick is mentioned. And according to Goldman in this book, Donald Hamrick had this belief that he wanted to make a reality. That, and I quote, the best way to promote communication between spacemen and Earthmen was through the Beatles. According to Goldman in his book, Hamrick was of the view that the Beatles had done such a great job of pushing and promoting meditation and also LSD, acid, to a mainstream audience, that they could do the same with his alien Earthmen agenda. Also, according to Goldman's book, in his book he claims that Anthony Cox's wife Melinda was a practicing witch and a member of the Harbingers, and that Hamrick had enlisted Melinda to do everything in her powers, her supernatural powers, to bring about and promote this link-up of Hamrick's, this alien Earthmen agenda, to link it up with the Beatles. In other words, Hamrick had enlisted Melinda and her so-called supernatural powers to attract the Beatles towards this Earthmen alien agenda that Hamrick was so desperate to promote to the world. Now, taking all of that into account, here's a suggestion, okay? This is just me throwing it out there. See what you think. Cast your mind back just a minute or two ago to that interview that John Lennon gave where he spoke about his hypnosis session with Hamrick, this failed bid, according to John, of Hamrick's to hypnotise John. Now, if you recall, in that interview, John claims that during this hypnosis session, two people suddenly burst into the room, one of whom was a quote-unquote magician. Now, what if that magician, that so-called magician that burst into the room, was Melinda? Okay, I know what you're probably thinking. You're probably thinking, well, hold on. If it was Melinda, John would have said in the interview that it was Melinda, right? Well, yeah, I suppose. Unless John had actually been placed, contrary to John's belief, under hypnosis by Hamrick, who placed John under hypnosis so that he could bring forth Melinda unrecognised to a hypnotised John, so that Melinda could use those so-called supernatural powers to lure John into this alien Earthman agenda that Hamrick was so desperate, reportedly, to push. It could well indeed be that Hamrick did approach John and offer to cure him of his smoking habit through hypnosis, but that could very well have been just a ruse, if you like, in order to lure John into the hypnosis session in Denmark back in 1970, in order for Hamrick to go ahead with this ulterior motive of his. And going back to earlier in this video presentation, if you recall, there was that video footage of John talking about a UFO sighting that he claims he saw in New York sometime in the mid-1970s. Is it possible that that has some connection to Hamrick and this hypnosis session of his? And then there's that book in John and Yoko's so-called Library of Esoterica that I mentioned before. That book, ETI, Space Beings Intercept Earthlings. Could that have something to do with this all as well? I'll leave it to you to decide, to think about. There's another kind of similar instance in John's life where something like this is said to have taken place. And this happened about 5 or so years after John's meeting and this hypnosis session with Hamrick in Denmark in early 1970. I'm going to fast forward now to kind of late 1974, early 1975. At this stage in John's life, he was living with his girlfriend of the time, May Pang, the earlier mentioned May Pang, who, of course, he's said to have witnessed this UFO with in New York. Now, what happened was sometime in 1973, John and Yoko's marriage was going through a bit of a rocky patch, so they split up. Basically, according to John, Yoko threw John out of their home and sent him packing, sent him on his way. But before she did that, she did something which is rather unusual for a wife to do. She sent him packing with a woman to take care of him, to basically shack up with him, if you like. And this woman was May Pang. Now, May Pang had actually worked for the Beatles company Apple. That's how John and Yoko got to know her, and eventually she went on to work for John and Yoko. So yeah, so here's John and Yoko going through this rocky patch in 1973, and Yoko throws John out of the marital home, as it were. The way that May has explained it, basically Yoko approached May and said to her that she wanted May to accompany John on his new life as a single man. Basically, Yoko enlisted the services of May Pang as a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, an approved partner? I don't know. Maybe some people might say there was something of a mind-controlling handler situation going on here. I don't know. It's all quite strange. Anyway, so that's what happened. John left the marital home. He was kicked out, and he left with May Pang. Now, according to the official John and Yoko sanctioned version of history, what happened over the next 18 months is what John dubbed his lost weekend, his so-called lost weekend. And this 18-month period was basically, according to the officially sanctioned John and Yoko version of history, what happened was John basically fell into the depths of despair and depression. He was so depressed not to be with his precious Yoko that he fell into this abyss of alcoholism and drug abuse and absolute manic depression. That's not what May claims happened. May has insisted that actually, on the contrary, this was not a lost weekend. John actually, according to May, during this 18-month period, felt emancipated. He felt as though he'd been freed from Yoko Ono's controlling clutches. And indeed, as May Pang has argued in various interviews, if this was a lost weekend, as described by John and Yoko in their officially sanctioned version of history, if it was such a lost weekend, well, it certainly doesn't show in John's recorded output over that time. During this so-called lost weekend, as May argues, he recorded 2 albums, the rock and roll album, a rock and roll covers album which came out in 1975. He also recorded his album Walls and Bridges. He also recorded a #1 single with David Bowie, which was Fame. He also recorded a number 1 track with Elton John, featured on the Walls and Bridges album, Whatever Gets You Through the Night. And he also produced an album for his friend, the singer Harry Nilsson. So yeah, May claims that if this was such a lost weekend, how is it that he was so prolific? Anyway, what happened was, not only was John going through a kind of artistic renaissance during this period, as May claims. But he was also rebuilding old relationships that had broken down since he'd got together with Yoko from his days in the 60s. And one of those relationships, most significantly, was with his ex-Beatle partner, Paul McCartney. And the way that May has explained it, Paul and John's rocky relationship post the split was almost a thing of the past. The two of them, Paul and John, were actually getting on so well that there was even talk of a possible Beatles reunion. Now, what happened was, according to May, one day around late 1974, early 1975, May claims that John said to May, how would you feel about me and Paul getting back together again and writing some music? At which point May said, how do I feel? Are you serious? You got to do it, man. You got to do it. Apparently what happened was, at that point in time, Paul McCartney was in New Orleans recording what was to become the Venus and Mars album with his band Wings. And John, spurred on by May's enthusiasm, actually booked tickets, plane tickets, to travel to New Orleans and go and see Paul in the recording studio. But then, just as this was about to happen, days before this was about to take place, according to May, the phone rang, and it was Yoko, and she wanted to speak to John. Apparently, she'd found a hypnotist who could cure him of his smoking habit. Where have we heard this before? So John said, okay, that sounds interesting, that sounds good. Now, according to May, what happened next was Yoko suggested that John should come over to the Dakota apartment building in New York, which was the apartment that Yoko had thrown John out of. This was their this was the former marital home that she'd thrown him out of. Yoko said to John, well, if you want to see this hypnotist guy, he's at the Dakota, why don't you come over and see him? So John said, yeah, okay. At which point May, as May has said in interviews since then, decades later, she felt uneasy about this. This didn't sit right with her, and she said to John, please don't go, John. I don't feel easy about this. There's something not quite right about this. And John said, no, it'll be fine. Don't worry. There's nothing to worry about. So off he went. Off he went to the Dakota. Now, in recounting this, looking back over it, May has given a couple of different versions of what happened next. Now, in most of her accounts, in interviews that she's talked about it in the decades since, she's claimed that John left for the Dakota, but was back the same night, and it was a Friday, if I'm not mistaken. He went to see this so-called hypnotist and returned that same day. But in at least one account, if I'm not mistaken, she actually claims that he left that day and didn't return for the entire weekend. But whatever version May has put forth, the conclusion is the same. When John returned from having visited that so-called hypnotist and Yoko at the Dakota, he came back a completely different man, as though he had been transformed. He didn't want to know Paul anymore. There was no interest whatsoever in flying over to New Orleans to see Paul. So whatever version of events you go with, whether it's John was away for a weekend or John was away just for one night, he came back a different person, with a completely different attitude towards Paul, as though time had gone back, had rewound back to the days when his attitude towards Paul was rather frosty, back to how his attitude was in the days right after the split when Paul and John weren't getting on too well. Now, in the version where May has said that John was away for an entire weekend, basically what happened was John told May that he was going to go and see this hypnotist and that he would be back shortly. But he wasn't back shortly. What he meant by shortly, if I'm not mistaken, was he would return within the next few hours. But he didn't. He was away for an entire weekend. And May did not see him again. She didn't see him for the entire weekend. And the next time that she saw him was on the Monday at a dentist's office, where the two of them had actually made an appointment to go and see their dentist. And the way that she's described it, upon seeing John at the dentist, and I'm quoting her here, she says, his eyes were red-rimmed and there were bags under them. This is what she's reported to have said. He looked at me vaguely and seemed dazed. His eyes were dilated and his manner was weird. So what happened next was they returned back to the place that they shared together. And it's at that point that John announced to May that he was leaving her and that he was going back to Yoko. And then he proceeded to pack some clothes into a bag. But before leaving May and going back to Yoko that day, he handed May two tiny bottles, two small little bottles filled with fluids, and said to May that he was to give May one of these small bottles of fluid as a present it was a gift from Yoko. And May has said that when she opened the bottle and sniffed at this fluid, she said it smelt absolutely disgusting. It was an oil. It was like something that she was meant to rub on her skin, like an ointment. But she says it smelled absolutely foul. Now, what she claims she did was she took it to an occult type shop, a shop where which specialised in occult items of like a head shop, if you like. And when the person took a look at this, the person in the store, in the shop, took a look at this bottle with this fluid in it. He opened it and had a sniff at it, and he said to May that whoever it was that had given her this bottle must have really, really hated her. Now, when I think of this bottle, this fluid, and its alleged occult connotations, and also the Dakota building where John and Yoko lived, they moved into the Dakota in 1973, and John was actually shot at the Dakota in December 1980. That's where he met the end of his life. When I think of this bottle and its occult connotations, as alleged by May Pang, I can't help but think of the movie Rosemary's Baby, which was released in 1968, directed by Roman Polanski. It stars Mia Farrow as Rosemary, who in the film plays the part of Rosemary, this lady who moves into an apartment building in New York with her husband. Now, the New York apartment building in the film is called the Branford Building, but actually the exterior shots in the film that we see of the Branford apartment building in New York is actually the Dakota. It's the Dakota starring as the Branford building. Now, to give you a very, very brief description of the film, basically it's a film in which Rosemary and her husband move into the Branford apartment building. Rosemary becomes pregnant, and she soon realises that the baby that she's given birth to is the son of the devil. There are neighbours that she and her husband have befriended in the Branford building who are actually practising Satanists, which is something she eventually discovers. Now, this connection that ties John Lennon to Rosemary's Baby is it's quite huge, actually, and I have actually published an article about it, which you can find on my site, The Occult Beatles, and I've also put together a video presentation. I published it some years back, and that is worth looking at. I'm not going to go into the full details of it here right now. If you want to go and watch that particular video presentation, if you haven't seen it, then if you want to know more, that's the place to go. Or alternatively, you can go and take a look at the article that I published about it at my site, The Occult Beatles, I think back in 2019, if I'm not too mistaken. Aside from the Dakota appearing in Rosemary's Baby, there are other links that connect John Lennon, the Beatles, not only to the movie Rosemary's Baby, but also Roman Polanski and his then wife at the time, who was Sharon Tate, who of course was murdered in August 1969 in the so-called Manson murders. And of course, if you want more Beatles connections, Mia Farrow was actually in India with the Beatles when the Beatles went to India in early 1968 to visit and stay with the Maharishi at his retreat in India. As I say, sometime in 1968, one of the many celebrity guests that was there was actually Mia Farrow. The connections just keep on going. There are so many of them. As I say, if you want to find out more, there is this video that I published and that you can find at my site, The Occult Beatles, and you can also find it at Conspiro TV, my YouTube page. As I say, if you want to find out a more in-depth analysis of that and more of those connections, that's the best place to go. But I'll mention one or two here while I'm at it. So yeah, I'm going to turn your attention again to the Dakota building, or as it's known in Rosemary's Baby, the Branford. Now, there's a scene in the film that we see, and it's a scene which begins, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while since I last saw the film, but I think the scene starts where we see the Satan-worshipping couple, this elderly couple, these neighbours that Rosemary and her husband have befriended. We see them on the street, walking along the street towards the entrance of the Branford building, and the closer they get, they realise that something has happened, something rather gruesome, violent has happened outside the entrance of the Dakota building, because there's a commotion going on, there's a crowd of people and there's police there, and the closer and closer this elderly couple get to the entrance and this commotion, they notice a dead body and on the curb. And this is right outside the spot where 12 years later, in 1980, John would go on to meet his own grisly death. Now, what's happened in the film is someone has fallen out of the building. Whether they jumped or whether it was whether the person that fell out of the building fell out, it was an accident, or whether they were pushed, or whether it was a suicide, it's not actually disclosed in the film. All that we know, all that we see is this dead body. And parked right next to this commotion is a Volkswagen Beetle, a white Volkswagen Beetle covered in blood. Right, okay, I'm going to turn your attention now to the Beatles' Abbey Road album, which was released in 1969. Now, if you look on that album cover, as you may know, this is an album cover that is steeped in Paul is Dead so-called clues. Now, if you look on that album cover, you've got the Beatles crossing the road, crossing this zebra crossing. And if you look behind them, there is a white Volkswagen Beetle. And if you look at John, he is dressed in white. So you have a Beetle in white. A white Volkswagen Beetle and a Beetle dressed in white. A white Beetle. And what do we have outside the Branford, which is actually the Dakota? We have a white Beetle covered in blood outside the spot where John would meet his death. It should also be pointed out that the very day that the Beatles took part in the photo session for that Abbey Road album cover was the very day that Sharon Tate was murdered in the so-called Manson murders. Now, as I said earlier, I don't want to go into too much detail here. If you want to know more, then you need to go take a look at this video that I mentioned, or go take a look at this article of mine at my site, The Occult Beatles. I'll also point out, very briefly though, that Charles Manson has links to the earlier mentioned Process Church of the Final Judgment. He was actually interviewed by The Process. The Process magazine, the Process Church magazine, there is an interview that was published with Charles Manson following the so-called Manson murders, and was published, as I say, in the Process Church magazine. So another little bit of a connection there. And with regards to connections, the actual reason that I've been talking for the last few minutes about these apparent connections between John Lennon, the Beatles, and Rosemary's Baby, and the so-called Manson murders, and everything that surrounds that, or many of the ingredients that surround that, is because of May Pang and this foul-smelling liquid that she claims that she got as a gift from Yoko Ono, because it does actually remind me of something from Rosemary's Baby, a scene or a number of scenes taken from the movie. If you recall, if you've seen the movie, there's a part in the film where the Satan-worshipping couple, this elderly couple that Rosemary and her husband have befriended, these neighbours of theirs in the Branford, aka the Dakota, they gift Rosemary with a neck pendant, if I'm not mistaken. As I say, it's been a while since I last saw the film, but if I recall, it was a neck pendant. The elderly couple gift Rosemary with this neck pendant, and encased within it is this herb, which is described as tannis root, and it's a pungent, rather foul-smelling substance. And whilst Rosemary wears it in the film, she gets more and more ill. Eventually, she grows suspicious about this pendant and especially this substance that's inside it, this so-called tannis root. So she does a little bit of detective work, and she looks through a book called All of Them Witches. And according to this book, the foul-smelling, pungent-smelling substance that's encased inside the pendant, this so-called tannis root, she finds out that this smell, this bad smell that's emanating from the pendant, from the neck pendant, is a fungus, a spongy matter used in rituals and worn on charms, and it's called devil's pepper. Pepper, you know, the devil's pepper. The devil is pepper. Sergeant Pepper. Just a thought. So yeah, in a way, this does kind of remind me, this pendant, this foul-smelling pendant that Rosemary has been gifted by this Satan-worshipping couple in the Branford, aka the Dakota, kind of reminds me of this gift that May claims she was given by Yoko, this foul-smelling substance that was inside this small bottle. And I'm going to tie this up, these so-called, these apparent connections, I'm going to tie them all up now by bringing us back to Mind Games, to the actual Mind Games album. And I'm going to turn your attention to the album cover. Now, the idea for the Mind Games album cover was John's. So it's claimed. He was responsible for the concept of the cover and its design. Now, so here is the Mind Games album cover, right? And now here is a promo poster, one of the promotional artworks that was published to promote the movie Rosemary's Baby. They're similar, right? Some might even say they're downright identical almost, perhaps. So there you go. As I say, apparently, according to official sources, John Lennon was the man who came up with the concept for the cover of the Mind Games album. And in the Mind Games book, there's some sketches he drew as he was trying to work out what he wanted for the cover. And there, what can you see but the Eye of Horus again? By the looks of it, he was thinking about featuring the Eye of Horus on the cover at some point. So, the Eye of Horus again. I was talking about that earlier on. There it is again. And as I mentioned earlier, the title track of the album Mind Games was released as a single, and here's the cover of the 7-inch vinyl copy. John's head has been opened and lots of Johns fly out of it. Multiple Johns fly out of his head. Occult mind control imagery, one might say. There was a variation of this mind control imagery issued of the single cover where Yoko is in John's head. John said that Mind Games, the song, not the lyrics, was inspired by a book he'd read that had been sent to him with the title Mind Games. It was an interesting book, he said. I enjoyed it. Actually, to give the book its full title, it's Mind Games, The Guide to Inner Space by Robert E. L. Masters and Gene Houston, and published in 1972, if I'm not mistaken. And if we're looking for possible clues pointing towards John and mind manipulation, or in other words, mind control, then this book, I think, is worth focusing in on. So, to give you a very brief and basic description of what the book is about then, it's a guidebook, or perhaps, to describe it more accurately, an instruction book in how to alter one's state of consciousness without the aid of drugs. To quote Houston in an interview, it's a book people can use to create altered states and explore their inner realms without drugs. Things like time distortion and visual landscapes. In the book, in order to achieve these states and explore these realms, one must do this in a group with other people. That's what it states in the book, and it's literally called a mind game. And within this group, one or more people should assume the role of guide, and the guide should be someone who's a psychologist. The guide, quoting from the book, helps the players to open inner doors, gateways to the other places within, and after that accompanies the player with the player when the voyage is over. And to read from the book, with the help of the guide, the players will learn to alter and expand consciousness. By this alteration and expansion, new ways of knowing and being will be experienced and explored. Players will use a pragmatic model of consciousness as a vast continuum of states of consciousness, many of these states lying far beyond the present experience of any player. Along this continuum and through these states, it is demonstrably possible to move into dimensions and types of awareness still little and in some cases almost wholly unexplored. With the help of the guide, the players will learn that what is sometimes called normal waking consciousness is only a very limited area comprising just a small range of states along the continuum. And within that range, still thought of as normal, players will learn that only a few of their capacities are accessible to them, and even those can be used only partially. The guide will enable the players to experience expansions of consciousness, movements along the continuum, and the resulting access to more and more of the players' potentials. Players will learn self-regulation of consciousness and, with this, will perceive that it is possible to expand the general norms of consciousness to enrich the experience and capacities to all human beings. And the guide will point out that this general expansion must expand the entire reality consensus, making the whole human reality deeper, broader, much more multidimensional and richer, until we one day look back astounded at the impoverished world of consciousness we once shared and supposed to be the real world, our officially defined and defended reality. One of the so-called mind games in the book is referred to as visual anthropology. Perhaps this is an example of the so-called inner realms and visual landscapes that Gene Houston says one can create by reading the book, because according to the book, this visual anthropology is described as the exploration and study of imaginary worlds. The book then explains that to participate in this particular game, the guide will send the mind gamer into a state where he or she will observe their body getting rounder in shape. They'll feel themselves morphing into a ball or a sphere, and then they'll hurtle at a great speed across vast reaches of space until they slow down and stop. And with their bodies resuming their normal shape, they will find themselves in another world. A strange world they've never seen before. The book encourages the gamer to, and I quote, investigate this world, its flora, its fauna, all of the animate and inanimate forms that are a part of this world. So, for example, if it has music, then you could bring back one or more songs from it, the book suggests. Likewise, if it has art, then on your return, reproduce it for all the rest of us to see and understand. The book then invites the player to, and I quote, to make some inquiries about its laws, customs, philosophies, religions, whatever is of interest to the player. The player then, on returning back to this world, the Earth world, is welcome to revisit again if they so choose. So that's visual anthropology. For me, personally, there's a particular mind game in the book that I can't help but compare to MK Ultra. The mind game, this so-called mind game in the book that for me makes me think of this, involves the players assuming a new identity, transferring themselves inside someone else, becoming someone else. And from the book, and I quote, the guide will instruct the players to pair off, and each couple is to be seated with the players facing one another. And the guide will say, this game can be variously described as an exercise in role-taking, in being someone else, in experiencing someone else who is being you, and in exploring how consciousness may become altered in the course of these approaches to interpersonal relationship. You don't have to understand these words, but you will come to understand by doing, just as you don't have to know who you are or who your partner is to play this game. And in fact, you don't know, do you? But you can look very closely now at your partner while you are listening just to me. You will look at each other and keep looking, but also letting your muscles relax and breathing deeply, conscious of relaxing and of breathing deeply and easily. And keep doing these things until your total reality consists of relaxation, breathing and feeling consciousness altering. Consciousness deepening as you look ever so closely, without wavering, at your partner, and attend to what is being said to you. And that will be the whole of your reality as you go deeper and deeper now, and keep going deeper and deeper. Now, as you keep looking at the face in front of you, you will notice changes in that face. Maybe subtle changes at first, but then more drastic changes, so that sometimes you will note that the face you are looking at now is not the same face you were looking at a moment before. And now just look at that face for a while, observing the occurrence of those changes. You may have seen many changes, or a few, and while you were observing those alterations, you were being looked at by your partner, and you were undergoing metamorphosis for your partner. And you don't know how you looked, how many faces, how many different identities you assumed for your partner as you were being observed. But you do know now that each person has many possibilities, many appearances, identities which may be waiting to emerge, and the possibility too of just being a screen upon which appearances, possibilities and identities may be projected by someone else. And the face that you customarily wear and the way you are ordinarily seen has nothing necessary about it, so that in some other time or place you might present a quite different appearance or be seen quite differently by other persons, even if you observe no difference in your appearance as compared to what you think that appearance is in your everyday life at the present time and place. going deeper and feeling yourself going deeper and listening and beginning to consider what it would be like to be that person you are confronting. Going deeper and wondering what it would be like to be in that body that sits there facing you, and beginning to know, to feel yourself into that mind-body system sitting there, and feeling yourself slipping into it as identities transfer themselves between bodies, going deeper and into that body so that it is you. And now, feeling that you are really being shaped in your thoughts and your feelings by your body, so that your new body increasingly gives to you the identity of that person who a while back was other, touch whatever you are seated on, knowing how this body touches things, and let the fingers feel, and the palms of the hands, remarking these new sensations and remembering. Taking on now all this body's perceptions, looking out at the world through these eyes, and looking over there at that person opposite you who was yourself, and from this new perspective, seeing that person who used to be yourself, and getting up and moving around, experiencing the consciousness that goes with the movements of this body in which you now are, and looking at the movements of that other body playing this game with you. Together with your partner now, examine the sensory possibilities. Drinking water, for example. Passing an object back and forth between you, walking along holding hands and remarking what that hand that was your hand feels like when touched with the hand of this body in which you now are and which is you. Being that awareness, being this person, how do you feel about the world around you? Are you any less happy or wiser, or are you less wise? And are you more or less fearful than you were before, more or less angry, more or less loving? And are you more or less alive, feeling everything very keenly, fully knowing it is as this person in this body, as you have become and as you now are? And now, slowly, find yourself moving back into the body that normally is yours, your consciousness shifting back into that body. And this transference is easy, fast, complete, as you are now that person, that body, as you were before this game began, although retaining anything of value you have learned. Fully yourself now, although quite possibly still feeling that you are in an altered state of consciousness, a trance, begin to discuss with your partner the experiences you had while playing the game, and try to determine how valid were some of the experiences you had, how complete the identification may have been, and whether you believe that these are valuable ways or not of learning something about another person, and possibly of increasing mutual understanding or otherwise improving interpersonal harmonies and communications. Another game has the guide teaching the players how to experience altered states without the need for a guide. In other words, to self-induce. And once this has been taught to a player, the guide will give the player a word that they can use for self-inducing themselves into a trance, or in other words, an altered state of consciousness. In the Mind Games book, the word which is given, described as a word image, the word that's offered up is butterfly. Butterfly, which, when uttered, has the player going into an altered state, pursuing a butterfly flying through the sky. Butterfly. Again, this has me thinking of MK Ultra. After all, there's the alleged MK Ultra program Project Monarch. Researcher and author Fritz Springmeier, in his book The Illuminati Formula, used to create an undetectable total mind-controlled slave, co-written with former mind control victim Cisco Wheeler, claims that, and I quote, "One of the primary reasons that the Monarch mind control programming was named Monarch programming was because of the Monarch butterfly. The Monarch butterfly learns where it has been born, i.e. its roots, and it passes this knowledge via genetics to its offspring from generation to generation. This was one of the key animals that tipped scientists off that knowledge can be passed genetically. The Monarch program is based upon Nazi goals to create a master race, in part through genetics. If knowledge can be passed genetically, which it is, then it is important that parents can be found that can pass the correct knowledge onto those victims selected for the monarch mind control. The children of these parents, according to Springmeier, and I quote, are placed in hospitals in captive, abusive conditions in order to traumatise them. And of course, earlier on in this presentation, I was talking about, I talked a little bit about trauma and how trauma can result in a mind branching off, being broken into different compartments, into different alters, in other words, and how it's said that that has been used by mind controllers to attach different personalities into those different alters, different personas, in order to further on the mind controller's agenda. And with regards to agendas, in this Mind Games book that John said that he'd read, that he enjoyed, and apparently read from page to page, there's mention of aliens, space aliens. And the reason that I mention this is because earlier on in this presentation I was talking about Donald Hamrick and his so-called alien agenda and his attempt, whether failed or not, to hypnotise John Lennon into pushing and promoting this alien human agenda that Hamrick, this CIA, this alleged CIA MK Ultra sponsored individual, wanted the Beatles and John Lennon to promote on his behalf. In the Mind Games book, and I quote, "I want to remind you that many of the best scientific minds of our time agree that in the vastness of the universe, many other intelligent life forms must have evolved. They hold it to be completely reasonable to suppose that intelligent life exists in many places throughout the universe at this present time. Now, this intelligent life might exist on other planets, but that life might also exist in space. It might exist in dimensions which overlap our own space-time. And it is very likely that such alien intelligent life forms do exist, and in some ways and places we have not even thought about. Moreover, it is also quite possible that some of these life forms have developed along lines similar or close to our own, or, if they are very dissimilar, that their intelligence is so great that they can communicate with us, understanding what we have to tell them, and enabling us to understand what it is that they would like to communicate to us. And they might communicate in our language, or they might communicate by means of images seen by you, or images heard by you, or you might just know without hearing or seeing, or using any of your other senses in any way familiar to you, what that message is." And the book goes on. "I want you to understand too that the very best way, and perhaps for the present the only way, is within the context of an altered state of consciousness. Go deeper now, deeper and deeper, and now in this altered state you will firmly believe and know for the duration of this game, this mind game, that it is possible for you to make such a contact, and you will be able to specify to some extent what kind of contact it is that you would like to make. You will intend and open yourself to contact with some being of an intelligence greater than human," and so on and so on. So again, I think this is worth mentioning, this meeting of human and alien life form. I think it's worth mentioning, given what I mentioned earlier on with regards to Donald Hamrick and his alleged connections to the CIA and his so-called human alien UFO agenda that he was said to be seeking to push with the help of John Lennon and the Beatles. In the Mind Games book, in Gene Houston's and Husband Robert's Mind Games book, it warns its readers, and I'll include John Lennon in that as one of its readers, it warns its readers, and I quote, that Guides might have to deal on occasion with the reluctance of some player to be aroused from the altered state. Anyone in trance not aroused from the trance will eventually just go to sleep and then awaken back into that ordinary waking state. But it may be inconvenient if a player will not terminate trance when required to do so, or will not communicate or acknowledge awareness of the guide. The guide will also encounter a few players who, on occasion, do not completely awaken from trance when the usual suggestions for waking are given. Those players then should be given additional instructions and countings until they feel themselves wide awake. Aside from writing a song as a result of reading this book, how else did the book influence John? Was he persuaded to enter into a mind game or two from reading it? Was his consciousness altered in any way by reading and playing the mind games? I think this is a timely juncture, with those questions considered, to bring to attention psychiatrists credited in the book with devising and testing, during the course of their experimental work, some of the mind games in the book. Because aside from Jean Houston and her husband, others helped in the compiling of the mind games featured in the book. People with some backgrounds you might find rather suspicious, to put it mildly. There's Bernard Aronson, a psychologist who in 1977 was revealed to have been involved in CIA experiments with LSD on inmates at a reformatory. This was going on with Aronson in the 1960s at the New Jersey Bureau of Research in Neurology and Psychiatry. Aronson was also the co-author of a book titled Psychedelics, published in 1970. His co-author was another of the guest contributors to the Mind Games book, none other than Humphrey Osmond, a British psychiatrist who's credited with actually coining the word psychedelic. Osmond was also pals with Aldous Huxley. Actually, Osmond was responsible for turning on Huxley to mescaline, which led to Huxley writing about his experience on the drug in the book Doors of Perception, which became something of a counterculture Bible during the 1960s. And Osmond actually was the the director of the earlier mentioned New Jersey Bureau of Research in Neurology and Psychiatry at the time that the CIA experiments with LSD were going on. He's also reported to have been involved not only with the CIA but MI6 as well. So, on to another contributor of the Mind Games, as featured in the book, Dr. John C. Lilly. His area of work and research was wide-ranging, including neurophysiology, neurophysics and psychiatry. Of all his research, he's perhaps best known for his experiments and work with isolation tanks. Now, these were tanks filled with water where people could float for long periods in what's described as sensory isolation. However, to quote Lilly, who incidentally rubbed shoulders with the likes of Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley, the earlier mentioned Aldous Huxley, the tank was a form of moving into an altered state of consciousness, into other realms. It took the participant, Lilly said, into, and I quote, expanded universes, ultimate realities, God. It was, and I quote, a doorway into the universe. It allows one to escape one's body. One's soul can leave, and one can clean one's karma from one's soul and become pure spirit and communicate with God. Important to add here that these experiments with the tanks were going on at the National Institutes for Health, a department within the US government. In fact, at the time Lilly was working on these experiments at the NIH, he was a commander in the US Public Health Service Corps. It's also been reported that, for a time at least, Lilly was keen enough to employ his experiments in sensory isolation during the so-called Cold War to modify and control the behaviour of so-called enemy agents. Indeed, in 1956, there's a news report in which a Dr. Robert H. Felix, director of the National Institute for Mental Health, informed a committee of senators that Lily's work with isolation tanks, and I quote, explain how brainwashing works. A long period of imprisonment in a dark, nearly silent cell is effective. With normal sensation cut off, the prisoner's thinking is disorganised. He grows desperately hungry for any kind of information, however unreliable, from the outside world. Okay, so that's a look at the backgrounds of some of the contributors to the Mind Games book. Now briefly on to the backgrounds of the authors, Jean Houston and her then husband Robert E. L. Masters. Jean Houston first. According to her official website, she's a PhD scholar, philosopher and researcher. When she was in her early 20s studying religion and philosophy, she says she was approached to work with some psychiatrists and physicians who'd been given US government grants to study the human effects of LSD on the human personality. So this was back sometime around the late 1950s, early 1960s, when the drug was still largely unknown to the mainstream public, a good few years before it became a drug of the so-called 60s counterculture, when it was being secretly used. This is in the late 50s, early 60s, at a time when it was being secretly used within the confines of the military intelligence complex and certain quarters of psychiatry, and of course as part of MK-Ultra. The reason Houston was approached by these psychiatrists and physicians who'd been given US government grants to study the human effects of LSD on the human personality, the reason she was approached by them, so she says, was because the US government wanted to learn more of her understanding and study of myths, symbols and archetypes. The government, she claims, was interested in learning about areas of the human psyche that it didn't understand. The kind of things Jean was studying at the time during her college studies into religion and philosophy, such as I say, myths and symbols and archetypes. And it's while working in this capacity that she met her husband-to-be, co-author-to-be of Mind Games, Robert Masters, a writer and researcher of human behaviour. Together they began to work on how to bring about altered states of consciousness without drugs, and this led to Robert building his very own sensory deprivation chamber. So these are the authors of this book that John wrote Mind Games as a result of, this book that he read. Houston has quite a resume. Aside from having rubbed shoulders with Aldous Huxley, yes, him again, she's been an advisor to UNICEF and has worked with the UN, the previously mentioned UN, training, according to her official website, training, and I quote, leaders in human and cultural development. And she's also worked as an advisor for President Bill Clinton and his wife Hillary, and assisted in the writing of one of her books as well. Okay, now back once again to John and Yoko's Library of Esoterica in the Mind Games book. In my intro of this presentation, you might recall that I focused in on the lyrics of John's song Mind Games and its lyric sheet that featured Magick with a K. This takes us into the realms of Aleister Crowley, of course, and Crowley hasn't been very far from presence within the pages of John and Yoko's Mind Games book, and Crowley gets a mention in the Mind Games book when it comes to John's forays into numerology, of which he and Yoko especially were practitioners of. Indeed, one of the books featured in their Library of Esoterica is Cairo's Book of Numbers, The Complete Science of Numerology, How Numbers Affect Your Health, Fortune, Life and Marriage. Cairo, born William John Warner in 1866, was an astrologer, and his name Cairo derives from the word chiromancy, the art of hand reading. Pages from Cairo's book are featured in the pages, within the pages of John and Yoko's Mind Games book. And actually, the Mind Games book states that the book that we see featured, Cairo's book, which is featured in the Mind Games book, is actually John's copy, actually the copy that John owned. And the pages that are featured in the Mind Games book of Cairo's book are the pages where Cairo gives the reader an explanation of the basics of numerology. And I quote, to give you an example, and I quote, "All occult studies point to the fact that the ancient students had a foundation for ascribing to every human being his number in the universe. And if we admit, as we do, that there is a moment for birth and a moment for death, so also in the links of years, days and hours that make up the chain of life, it is not illogical to assume that every link of life has also both its number and place. I claim that by such a study, man may become more perfect by his fitting in with the laws, system and order of things to which he owes his being. In this study, there is nothing antagonistic to religion or to our present-day acceptance of the idea of God. On the contrary, man will but honour God the more by his more perfect obedience to nature's laws. In the ancient Hebrew Book of Solomon, for example, we can yet read his inspiring words. I thank thee, O great creator of the universe, that thou hast taught me the secrets of the planets, that I may know the times and seasons of things, the secrets of men's hearts, their thoughts, and the nature of their being. Thou gavest unto me this knowledge, which is the foundation of all my wisdom." It is these self-same secrets of the planets, Cairo goes on in his book, that I have endeavoured to teach in these pages. I now ask my readers to give their attention and concentration to the following system, which I will put as briefly and in as clear language as possible. To find the exact day in any month of the year whose vibration will be favourable, or in other words, lucky to any individual, the simplest rule is to work out by the following table the occult number produced by the letters of their name. The ancient Chaldean and Hebrew alphabet sets out the number or value of each letter. It is the best system I know for this purpose. And in the book, Cairo goes on to set out a table with each letter of the alphabet and its representative number. And what I've done here is I've put together my own graphic of that. So there you've got A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, D 4, E 5, F 8, G 3, H 5, and so on, as you can see there. As you may have noticed, and indeed as you probably are already aware if you're even slightly aware of the logistics of numerology, and as Cairo mentions in his book, and I quote, "It will be seen that there is no number 9 given in the alphabet, this table of letters and numbers, for the simple reason that those ancient masters of occultism knew that in the highest sphere, the number 9 represents the 9-lettered name of God, and for this reason no single letter was ascribed to it. As you may also know, if your name is John, for example, what you do in numerology is you spell out your name John, say for example on a piece of paper, and then you look at the value of each letter, what number represents each of those letters that spells the name John. So J is 1, represents 1, O is 7, H is 5, and N is 5. So if you add 1, 7, 5 and 5 together, that comes up to 18. Before you break it down, before you break up the 1 and the 8 and add those two together, it adds up to 18. And Cairo describes the 18, that total, that is a compound number. It's described as a compound number before you break it down to a 1 and an 8 and then get 9. Now, with regards to 9, Cairo goes on to state that if the letters in a name should total up and produce the number 9, the meaning of it is given as 1. I'm not going to focus at all on the actual mechanics of what Cairo explains in the pages of his Book of Numbers. I'm just going to focus in on what John has scribbled in some of the pages that we can see here in the Mind Games book, as featured in the Mind Games book. So here we have the page where Cairo gives an explanation, an example how one should use numerology for themselves. So he uses, so for example, if you want to add up the value according to numerology of your name and what it stands for, this is how you would do it. And Cairo uses the name John Smith to illustrate that. And as you can see, John Lennon in the middle of that has put his surname in there. So he's taken, so John obviously has looked at the name John and seen that it's already there in the book. Cairo's already put it there. So J equals 1, it represents 1, O is 7, H is 5, N is 5. That adds up to the compound number, which is 18. You separate those two. 1 plus 8 is 9, and there John Lennon has scribbled in his surname. L is 3, E is 5, N is 5, N 5 again, O 7, N 5 again. That comes up to 30. That equals 30. That's the compound number. 0, well, you can't add that up to anything, so you ignore that, and you've got 3. So 9, which is the number we get from John, and 3 from Lennon, that equals 12, of course. And here at the bottom you can see that at the bottom of the very same page, John has taken that compound number, 9 plus 3 is 12, and in brackets I'm assuming he's worked out that adds up to 3. I can't think of any other reason why he would put 3 there, why he would scribble that in there on the page. And underneath there you've got his date of birth, the 9th of the 10th, 1940, October the 9th, 1940. And here's some more of his doodlings on a blank page here. I'm assuming this is from Cairo's book, from a page in Cairo's book, but a blank page, and John has just scribbled all over it his estimations, his just working out there, his numerological representations of various aspects of his life, like his not only his surname and his Christian name, also his middle name there, Winston, John Winston Lennon. That's what he was born as, John Winston Lennon, in Liverpool. He later changed his middle name to Ono, so we have Ono also featured there. His year of birth, 1940, and all kinds of things. Tokyo, that will be a reference to Yoko there. Liverpool, of course, where John was born. New York, where John moved to eventually in the 70s, and various other little calculations there using numerology. I've saved the most compelling doodle by John on this particular page from the book till last. I really don't know what's going on here, so I'll just show it to you and just leave you to make up your own mind. So on the same blank page where John has doodled, which, as I say, I'm presuming is a blank page which was from Cairo's book, and John has doodled all over it. If you look at the top of the page here, let's just revisit the top of the page here. What have we got there? We have, so next to where we have John Lennon and John calculating the numerological value of his name, what have we got there? Beneath 12 equals 3. What does that say? Am I reading that wrong, or does that say victim sacrifice? Does that say victim sacrifice? What is going on there? And in the Mind Games book, on the page that precedes that, we have this. The 7-pointed seal of Solomon. To quote from the Mind Games book, this diagram, this symbol of the 7-pointed seal of Solomon, and I quote, "The 7-pointed star contains the 9 numbers that constitute the base of all calculations and is the root of the system of numbers as applied to human life, such as the sun. The sun with the numbers 1 to 4 represents the combination of the sun and the planet Uranus, the male quality of creation being the sun with the feminine Uranus of the mental or spiritual plane," and so on. You can see it there on the page. And below that symbol for the 7-pointed seal of Solomon, you've got the 4 divisions of the zodiac: fire, water, air and earth. And actually, if you buy the box set of Mind Games, the CDs, here they are, the CDs that are featured in the box set feature these symbols amongst others as well. And further on in the pages of the Mind Games book, there's more examples of numerology. Here on Apple notepaper, the Beatles company Apple, we have some more of it, and I'm assuming these are John's doodlings. These are some more of John's numerological calculations, and there you can see Aleister Crowley, his name spelt out, and John, and I'm presuming it's John, has calculated Crowley's so-called occult number. Other names featured here, he's got Mick Jagger on there, he's got Keith Richard, May Pang, Marianne Faithfull, of course, who was Mick Jagger's girlfriend for half of the 1960s into the early 70s. Gloria Steinem, the notorious feminist campaigner who it later transpired in later decades, following on from the 60s when she made her name, it transpired that she was being paid by the CIA. Also Dick Gregory, the Plastic Ono Band, and on it goes. What I'm thinking is, some of these names that John has scribbled on this notepaper, this Apple notepaper, you can kind of understand why he chose to scribble out and work out numerological calculations for some of these names, like Mick Jagger and Keith Richard. I mean, these are people that John knew. He was friends with these people, especially during the 1960s when the Beatles and the Stones were at their peak, commercially speaking. So Mick Jagger, Keith Richard, John knew these guys personally. May Pang, obviously, Marianne Faithfull. So, the Plastic Ono Band, of course, again, that was his backing band. That was John's backing band. So and Yoko is there, of course. There she is. There's Yoko on the notepaper. You can kind of understand why John would feature these names, would think of these names, would want to scribble out these names. These are names of people who are closely associated to him personally. So it makes it all the more interesting to me that of all those names that have some personal connection to John, John would include Aleister Crowley in there. So this must have been a name of importance to John, I would suggest. Aleister Crowley also gets a mention in John and Yoko's Mind Games book in the pages focusing in on the couple's interest in the I Ching, which includes the practice of throwing coins to guide you in your life. Or, to quote from John and Yoko's book, 3 coins are used to make a hexagram, which then provides guidance according to the description attributed to it in the I Ching. So here's the hexagram. Three coins are tossed simultaneously. Coins such as these. These are John's coins, John's I Ching coins. And to quote further from the Mind Games book with regards to this, a coin that lands heads up has a value of 2, and a coin that lands tails up has a value of 3. By adding the 3 values together, you arrive at the number 6, 7, 8, or 9. The numbers 7 and 9 create yang lines, and 6 and 8 create yin lines. Now I must note here that having looked into various interpretations by various experts on how to use the I Ching, there are a number of different ways to go about this. How to read the coins, what they mean, their value, what they represent, and so on. 2 long-winded to go into here, so I'll just stick to what the Mind Games book is explaining with regards to the implementation of the I Ching. So back to the book, and I quote, "Each hexagram is built from the bottom up with a separate toss of 3 coins. 2 of the values, 6 and 9, result in old lines, meaning moving or changing. 2 values, 7 and 8, result in young lines, meaning static or unchanging." So here's an example hexagram. Again quoting from the Mind Games book, "After the commentaries relating to the hexagram have been studied, a second hexagram is formed by changing any old yin lines to young yang lines and any old yang lines into young yin lines. The second hexagram is then also studied. Each hexagram is composed of 2 trigrams, each of 8 possible configurations of yin and yang lines. Each trigram has an affinity in nature. And this element can form part of the overall reading. For example, hexagram number 4 is mountain above water. And here's some pages featured in the Mind Games book of John's I Ching diary from 1973, featuring his yin and yang lines. If you look here, again, same as with the numerology, his doodlings on the apple paper, his doodlings with the numerology there. He's focusing in again here on personal aspects of his life. Yoko is mentioned there. Also Utopia, the earlier mentioned Utopia, the Beatles company Apple. That would have been playing on his mind. A very important aspect of his life. He would have been wanting to know what the future held for that company, and I suspect, and its energy, the energies that would have been surrounding that, its possible fate. And in amongst all of that, what do we have here? Magick, with a question mark on the end, and magic as in magic with a K. Make of that what you will. Take a look at that and work that out for yourself. Another book in John and Yoko's Library of Esoterica is Woodstock Nation, a talk rock album by the earlier mentioned Abbie Hoffman, and published in 1969. There isn't much point or need to focus on the book here, but I think there is some merit in shining a light on Hoffman, a so-called radical activist in the US during the late 60s and early 70s. He was one of the so-called Chicago 7, a group of activists who were arrested and stood trial in the US in 1969 following protests outside the Democratic Party's National Convention in Chicago in 1968. The US government charged the 7 with conspiracy and crossing state lines to incite riots. Ultimately, all of the 7 were acquitted of the conspiracy charges, but 5 were found guilty of incitement to riot. But these convictions were overturned not that long later. When John and Yoko moved to the US in 1971, initially John, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, aligned himself with so-called radicals, including Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. Upon our arrival in the US, John is quoted as saying in his Mind Games book, "We were practically met off the plane by Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman and promptly taken on a tour of New York's underground." And here's some photos from the Mind Games book of John and Yoko with Hoffman and Rubin during those early days of John's arrival in the US in 1971. In that top photo there, you have Rubin next to Yoko, then John and Abbie next to him. And in the photo beneath that, Abbie with John. Also in the book, here's a photo of Jerry Rubin playing bongos on stage behind John and Yoko at the John Sinclair Freedom Rally in December 71, as mentioned earlier in this presentation. Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin in the 60s were co-founders of the Youth International Party, otherwise known as YIP, but more commonly referred to, I think, as the Yippies. The Yippies and Hoffman and Rubin delivered a different approach to the traditional form of protest, instead using theatrics and outlandish showmanship and parody and pranks to make their point. And I'm thinking that this might be at least one reason why John Lennon was warned to break his close ties with Hoffman and Rubin, as I mentioned earlier, amidst claims the pair were secretly working for the CIA. My thinking is that there might have been suspicions amongst some in the protest movement at the time, that's the protest movement as a whole outside of the Yippies territory, that Hoffman and Rubin's form of theatrical prankish protest not only trivialised the protest movement as a whole, in other words, threatened the serious credibility of the rest of the movement who were legitimately protesting against the Vietnam War and other issues at hand at the time, but also that perhaps this trivialisation was deliberate on the part of Rubin and Hoffman in order to discredit the anti-Vietnam War movement on behalf of the CIA and the US government. Just to give you a couple of examples, just 3 days before the earlier mentioned Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968, when then US President Lyndon B. Johnson's Vice President Hubert Humphrey had announced his acceptance of the nomination of the Democratic Party to run for president, members of the Yippies, including Rubin, appeared in Chicago to unveil their candidate for president, a black and brown pig they named Pegasus. It's reported that the Yippies, and I quote, said their candidate had more going for him than any of the other candidates who'd run for nomination, and to quote the Yippies, if we can't have him in the White House, that's Pegasus, we can have him for breakfast. Another example, on October 21st, 1967, a reported 100,000 people marched in Washington in an anti-war rally, and a number of those, some 30 or 40,000 or so it's reported, then marched on to the Pentagon building, including Hoffman. Prior to this, Hoffman appeared before the press to announce what he and his people were going to do once getting to the notorious building.
And we're going to assemble a mass of holy men to surround the Pentagon. And they're going to surround it with chanting and love and drum beating. And the Pentagon is going to rise into the air on October 21st. And when it gets about 300 feet in the air, it's going to start to vibrate. Slowly at first, and then a little quicker. And all the evil spirits are going to pour out.
Allen Ginsberg was at the attempt to levitate. It said he opened the proceedings by chanting Om, and music was played. So there you go. Make of that what you will. As I mentioned earlier, some might look upon all of that with suspicion, a bit like when John announced the formation of Newtopia. People looking at this from the outside might think these symbolic gestures, and at the time might have thought these symbolic gestures, cheapen one's credibility, and as a result the overall protest against the Vietnam War and or the US government of the time. What is a fact, though, is that John was being surveilled by the FBI. He suspected it at the time, but it wasn't proved conclusively until decades after his death, following Freedom of Information requests. What's also a fact is that Nixon's US government of the time wanted John deported from the States. To quote John from the Mind Games book, "Oh yeah, they picked on me. I'm telling you, when it first started, I was followed in a car and my phone was tapped. I can't prove it. I just know there's a lot of repairs going on in the cellar. I know the difference between the phone being normal when I pick it up and when every time I pick it up, there's a lot of noises. I'd open the door and there would be guys standing on the other side of the street. I'd get in a car and they'd be following me in a car and not hiding. They wanted me to see I was being followed. I think they wanted me to know, to scare me. And I was scared, paranoid. And people thought, oh, crazy Lennon, who's going to bother following him? What an egomaniac." But we had been associated with Jerry Rubin and John Sinclair and little rallies and were seen around these people. It really was like a mini Watergate. In the Mind Games book, John says, with regards to his battle with US immigration, It was Strom Thurmond who cast the first stone. He wrote to the then Attorney General of the United States, John Mitchell, suggesting that somehow they throw us out of America before the Republican Party convention in San Diego. I understand the reasoning behind the attack, especially after one of our big-mouthed revolutionary heroes had broadcast to the world that John and Yoko were organising a mass rally to blow away the Republicans at San Diego. And here is that memo from then US Republican Senator Strom Thurmond to then US Attorney General Mitchell from February 1972 and as featured in the Mind Games book. And in this document, this is a memo from none other than then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. He claims that, and I quote, "During February 1972, a confidential source who has furnished reliable information in the past advised that Lennon had contributed $75,000 to a newly organised New Left group formed to disrupt the Republican National Convention." In the Mind Games book, John says, "The biggest mistake Yoko and I made in that period was allowing ourselves to become influenced by the male macho serious revolutionaries and their insane ideas about killing people to save them from capitalism and or communism, depending on your point of view. We should have stuck to our own way of working for peace, bed-ins, etc. The thing that bothered most of our revolutionary brothers was the fact that we weren't against anything. Just 4 things, like peace and love and all that naive crap. But that wasn't macho enough. I mean, man, they were the Chicago 7 and knew the Black Panthers." Elsewhere in the Mind Games book, he's quoted as saying, "If you want peace, you won't get it with violence. Please tell me one militant revolution that worked. Sure, a few of them took over, but what happened? Status quo. And if they smash it down, who do they think is going to build it up again? And when they've built it up again, who do you think is going to run it? And how are they going to run it? They don't look further than their noses. The system smashing scene has been going on forever. What's it done? The Irish did it, the Russians did it, and the French did it. And where has it got them? Nowhere. It's the same old game. Who's going to run this smashing up? Who's going to take it over? It'll be the biggest smashers. They'll be the ones that get in first, and they'll be the ones to take over. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's down to people. What I said in Revolution, the Beatles song, in all the versions is change your head. The only way to ensure a lasting peace of any kind is to change people's minds. There's no other way. The government can do it with propaganda. Coca-Cola can do it with propaganda. Why can't we? These left-wing people talk about giving power to the people. That's nonsense. The people have the power. All we're trying to do is make people aware that they have the power themselves. And the violent way of revolution doesn't justify the ends. All we're trying to say to people is to expose politicians and expose the people themselves who are hypocritical and sitting back and saying, "Oh, we can't do anything about it. It's up to somebody else." Give us the answer, John. People have to organise. Students have to organise voting. When it gets down to having to use violence, then you're playing the system's game. The establishment irritate you, pull your beard and flick your face to make you fight, because once they've got you violent, then they know how to handle you. The only thing they don't know how to handle is non-violence and humour. The thing they sure as hell know is how to handle you if you're violent, because they'll irritate you and knock you and do this to you and keep doing that until they make you fight, and they know how to fight you. But if you fall for that, then you've lost. Now, where John Lennon's 1972 album, Sometime in New York City, was a protest album from first track to finish, 1973's Mind Games album was the opposite, with the exception of one track perhaps, Bring on the Lucy, Free the People. I say perhaps because from reading the lyrics to the song, it's not entirely clear to me if it is or isn't a protest song of some form, although if I had to stick my neck out, and I'm going to right now, if I've got to stick my neck out, I'd say, yeah, it is. Quite possibly a protest song aimed squarely at the then US President Nixon and his administration. We're nearing the end of my presentation, and I think this is a good place to draw it to a close, because it'll bring us back full circle, as it were, to where I began it, and you'll maybe see what I mean by drawing your attention first to some of the lyrics of Bring on the Lucy. So here are some of those lyrics. You're making all our decisions. We have just one request of you, that while you're thinking things over, here's something you just better do. Free the people now. Do it, do it, do it, do it. Then later he sings, you think you're cool and know what you're doing. 666 is your name. Now, when John was asked about the song, he said, oh, what does it mean? What the hell does it mean? I keep asking myself, but how the hell should I know? It's just something that came into my head. Lucy is just one of those things after Lucy in the Sky. Lucy keeps staying in my head. They, the lyrics, have been around a long time. I just never put them on paper. It's in the Bible, isn't it? The great beast, 666. The reason it actually cropped up is because I had all my books sent from England, and I had a few by Aleister Crowley that I'd had for years. He was just in my consciousness. So up he pops again, as he's done throughout this presentation, including right at the beginning of it, Aleister Crowley, and who of course is sometimes referred to as the Great Beast. So yes, I think a good place here to bring this to a close. It's come full circle. It began with Aleister Crowley and John Lennon, and it ends with Aleister Crowley and John Lennon. Thank you very, very, very much for watching, for listening. Don't forget to check out my various websites. There's the previously mentioned Occult Beatles site. You can find that at the occultbeatles.wordpress.com. There's also the previously mentioned Conspiro Media, a website where I focus in on evidence of there having been a social engineering enterprise going on back in the 60s in Britain during the so-called counterculture era. You can find that site at conspiromedia.wordpress.com. There's also a Facebook site, which is kind of an amalgamation and then some of Conspiromedia and the Occult Beatles. You can find that at facebook.com/Conspiromedia/. That's facebook.com/Conspiromedia/. There's also a Spreaker page, Conspiromedia by Matt. That's the Spreaker page. And if you don't mind me mentioning this, I've got a Buy Me a Coffee page. No pressure, but yeah, if you fancy throwing a couple of coins into the tin, please do so. That's buymeacoffee.com/Conspiromedia. That's buymeacoffee.com/Conspiromedia. Thank you very, very much once again. I really appreciate you being here and watching and listening. Until the next time.